Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back way back to a time when the world felt a lot bigger, a lot colder, and a lot less certain than it does now. Imagine wrapping yourself in rough wool, the kind that scratches just thinking about it, feeling the biting, damp chill of an ancient Irish evening seeping into your bones. You can almost smell the peat smoke hanging heavy in the air, can't you? See the low huddled shapes of thatched roofs against a sky that's more gray than anything else. This isn't the postcard Ireland of rolling green hills and charming pubs. Oh no, this is 10th century Ireland, a place where survival wasn't guaranteed and the line between life and death was thinner than a spiderweb on a frosty morning. You're standing there, the mud squelching under your worn hide shoes, the wind whipping around you, and deep down you just know you probably won't survive this place for long without some serious luck. It's a world shaped by the seasons, by the soil, and by the ever-present specter of hunger. Famine wasn't a history lesson back then. It was a potential death sentence lurking just beyond the next failed harvest. And when that shadow stretched its icy fingers across the land, people sometimes did things. Well, things that history whispers about, things that sound like they belong more in a nightmare than a history book. Tonight, we're going to delve into some of those whispers, the chilling practices that might have emerged when desperation pushed people to the absolute brink. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always cool to see how far these little journeys travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're there now, truly there, standing on the edge of a small cluster of huts in what passes for a village. The air smells of damp earth wood smoke and something else. Something wild and untamed that hasn't been paved over yet. The quiet is different from modern quiet. It's punctuated by the lowing of cattle, the distant bleating of sheep, maybe the squawk of a raven. There are no cars, no humming refrigerators, no distant sirens. Just the world raw and unfiltered. The structures are simple round houses or rectangular buildings made of wattle and daub, perhaps, with stone foundations in some areas. The roofs are thick thatch essential insulation against the relentless Irish weather. You see people moving about, women tending small plots of vegetables or stirring pots over open fires, outside men working with animals or repairing tools. Life is physical, immediate, tied directly to the land. Ireland in the 10th century wasn't a unified kingdom in the way you might think of England or France at the time. Instead, it was a patchwork of small kingdoms, or tuathae, each ruled by a local king or rear. These kings were often in conflict, raiding each other's lands, stealing cattle, and vying for power. This constant low-level warfare, while perhaps not as devastating as large-scale invasions, certainly added another layer of instability to life. You might be thriving one moment, and the next, a rival entry sweeps through, taking your livestock, your primary source of wealth and sustenance, and burning your fields. It's like playing Monopoly, but instead of landing on boardwalk with a hotel, someone just burns your entire property portfolio to the ground. Permanently, and probably takes your top hat too. The economy, such as it was, revolved around agriculture, particularly cattle. Cattle were currency, status symbols, and food on the hoof. A wealthy person had many cattle, a poor person had few. Grains like barley and oats were grown along with some rye and wheat, especially in more favorable areas. But the yields were low by modern standards. You couldn't just nip down to the local superstore when your pantry was bare. There was no local superstore. Your pantry was the root cellar, the grain store, and the herd in the field. If any of those failed, you were in deep trouble. Historians still argue whether the population density in 10th century Ireland was high enough to put significant pressure on resources before the crisis hit, or if the system was relatively sustainable until external factors like bad weather or conflict triggered widespread collapse. Some scholars point to archaeological evidence suggesting dispersed settlement patterns and relatively small field systems, implying communities were largely self-sufficient and spread out. Others look at historical accounts of large gatherings for festivals or political assemblies and argue that population centers, perhaps around monasteries or royal sites, existed and would have required more intensive food production, making them more vulnerable. It's like trying to guess how many people lived in your neighborhood 1,000 years ago, just by looking at old maps and guessing where the houses might have been. tricky business. Speaking of monasteries, they played a significant role in society. They weren't just centers of religious life. They were also centers of learning craftsmanship and often wealth. They owned land, sometimes vast tracts, and could be significant agricultural producers themselves. Monasteries also served as refugees during times of conflict, though they weren't immune to being raided themselves sometimes for their riches, sometimes just for their stores of food. Imagine your church also being the biggest farm and the only library in town. That was sort of the deal. Life was governed by the rhythms of nature. The growing season was short, the winters long, and often harsh. Spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest. These weren't just tasks, they were acts of faith. You put seeds in the ground and prayed for the sun, the rain, and protection from blight or pests. The success of the harvest was literally a matter of life and death for the community. If the spring was too wet, the seeds would rot. If the summer was too dry, the crops would wither. If the autumn was too cold and wet, the harvest would fail or spoil. It was a constant dance with forces you couldn't control. The vulnerability wasn't just about grain. Animals needed pasture, and if the weather was bad, the grass wouldn't grow. If the winter was long and fodder ran out, the animals would die. And remember, cattle were mobile wealth. They could be driven away in a raid. Grain stores couldn't exactly run away. So while grain was essential, losing your cattle could be just as devastating, if not more so in terms of long-term recovery. You might be able to replant next year if you had seed, but rebuilding a herd took years. The sheer precariousness of this existence is hard for us to fully grasp today. We live in a world where food is generally abundant and readily available. We have global supply chains, refrigeration preservatives, and government aid programs, even if imperfect, to prevent mass starvation. In 10th century Ireland, your food came from your land, or the land of your immediate neighbors, or maybe a short distance away through trade or raid. If the land failed, you failed. If your neighbors failed, you were on your own, or you starved together. It put a whole new spin on borrowing a cup of sugar from next door, didn't it? Except it was probably grain or milk, and if they didn't have any, you were both out of luck. This constant threat, this knife-edge existence, meant that people lived in a state of heightened awareness, not just of the natural world, but of the unseen forces that they believed controlled it. The line between the natural and the supernatural was incredibly blurry, almost non-existent. Every unexplained event, a sudden storm, a blight on the crops, a mysterious sickness, could be interpreted as a sign, a message, or a punishment from the gods, the spirits of the land, or increasingly, by the 10th century, the Christian God and saints. So as you stand there, imagine the weight of this hanging over you. The hard work, the simple diet, the ever-present awareness that things could go terribly wrong. It wasn't just about surviving this year. It was about ensuring the land would yield next year and the year after that. It was about placating whatever powers controlled the sun, the rain, the fertility of the soil, and the health of the animals. This was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Or more accurately, this was the shaky ground on which everything else tottered. This is the world that could give rise to desperate measures. When the usual prayers, the usual offerings, the usual farming practices failed, and the specter of starvation loomed, what would you do? What could you do? The records from this time aren't always clear. They're often written by monks centuries later, or they are fragmented mentions in annals or laws. They hint at times of extreme hardship, at famines that wiped out communities, that forced people to eat things they normally wouldn't, to abandon their homes, or perhaps to engage in practices that seemed utterly bizarre, perhaps even horrifying from a modern perspective. These are the chilling rituals mentioned in the title. Not necessarily common everyday occurrences, but extreme responses born of unimaginable pressure. It's the kind of thing that makes you pull your blanket a little tighter, isn't it? The thought of people pushed so far that the unthinkable becomes thinkable. You feel the damp seeping into your feet, the wind carrying a chill that seems to promise worse weather to come. The sky is already darkening. The scent of smoke is stronger now as evening meals are prepared. Likely a simple pottage of grain and whatever vegetables could be grown, perhaps some milk or cheese if the animals were producing. Meat was probably a rare luxury reserved for feasts or important occasions, not something you'd have every day unless you were exceptionally wealthy. Unless, of course, an animal died unexpectedly, in which case you ate it quickly before it spoiled. Waste not, want not, right. Though in this era, Want not was a constant struggle. The sounds of the village begin to die down as darkness settles. People gather inside their homes, lit only by the flickering light of a fire. There's no electricity here, no screens glowing, just the crackle of burning peat, the shadows dancing on the walls, and the murmurs of families. Maybe stories are told, legends of heroes and monsters, or cautionary tales passed down through generations. Maybe prayers are offered asking for protection, for warmth, for food to last until morning. The quiet outside deepens, filled only by the sounds of the natural world and your own breathing. The concept of chilling rituals in the context of famine in 10th century Ireland is not something you'll find neatly described in a single historical text titled Famine Rituals for Dummies. It's more about piecing together fragments, mentions of unusual offerings, hints of desperate acts recorded in annals, interpretations of archaeological finds, and parallels drawn from the folklore and mythological cycles that preserved echoes of ancient beliefs and practices. The term itself is a modern interpretation, a way of grouping potential responses that went beyond conventional religious rites or practical survival strategies like foraging for wild foods. It suggests something that might have involved appeasement of angry deities or spirits, attempts to restore fertility to the land through sympathetic magic, or even more disturbing acts born of sheer, unadulterated panic and hunger. Think about it. When everything you rely on, the land, the weather, your animals, seems to turn against you and prayer doesn't seem to work, what's left? You might start to believe that something powerful is angry, something that needs to be appeased. Or you might look for ways to shock the natural world back into productivity. The human mind, when faced with existential threats, can come up with some pretty creative and sometimes terrifying solutions. And in a world where the veil between the physical and spiritual was so thin, those solutions often involved interacting directly with the unseen realm. This wasn't a society with a modern scientific understanding of meteorology or soil science. They understood the practicalities of farming through long experience. But the ultimate control over these things was attributed to forces beyond human comprehension, forces that had to be respected, feared, and perhaps manipulated. So when the crops failed year after year, or a mysterious plague struck the cattle, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a cosmic problem, a sign that something was fundamentally wrong in the relationship between humanity and the powers that govern the world. And fixing a cosmic problem might require a cosmic solution, however strange or demanding it might seem. You settle down inside a hypothetical roundhouse, the air thick with the smell of smoke and unwashed bodies. Personal hygiene wasn't exactly a high-tech affair back then. Imagine a communal bath situation that involved a cold stream and perhaps some harsh soap or maybe just rain. You pull a rough wool blanket around you, feeling the prickle against your skin. The fire is the only source of warmth and light. The sounds from outside fade almost completely except for the wind sighing around the thatch and the occasional distant howl of a wild animal. Sleep comes hard here, not just because of the discomfort, but because the worries of tomorrow, the hunger, the cold, the uncertainty, press down on you. This wasn't just survival of the fittest in an abstract sense. It was a daily gritty battle. As you drift off, the images from the day linger. The hard faces of the villagers etched with the constant struggle, the sparse landscape under the unforgiving sky, the gnawing fear that whispers, what if the harvest fails? This fear, this deep-seated anxiety about starvation, is the breeding ground for the desperate measures we will explore. It's the understanding that when your stomach is empty and your future looks bleaker than a bog in December, you might consider things you never thought possible, things that chill you to the bone even 1,000 years later. You spent the night in that smoky roundhouse, the rough wool scratching the sounds of the ancient world outside a lullaby of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. But sleep, if it came, was probably shallow, because the fear of hunger wasn't just a sudden punch to the gut, it was a creeping dread, a slow-motion disaster that you could often see coming if you knew how to read the signs. Think of it like watching a storm gather. You see the clouds darken, the wind pick up, the birds behaving strangely long before the first drop of rain hits. In 10th century Ireland, the signs of impending famine were etched into the landscape and the rhythms of life itself. The most obvious signs, of course, were tied directly to the land and the weather. You lived or died by the success of your crops and your animals. So you watched the sky and the soil like your life depended on it, because it did. Was the spring unusually cold and wet, drowning the freshly sown seeds in the ground? before they could even dream of sprouting. Or perhaps it was bone dry, turning the earth into a hard, cracked surface that resisted the plow and offered no moisture to young plants. Too much rain meant waterlogged fields, risk of rot, and difficulty harvesting peat for fuel. Too little rain meant stunted growth, withered crops, and dry wells. A late frost after the plants had started to emerge could be devastating, wiping out the fragile young sprouts. An early, harsh winter could catch people unprepared, freezing the remaining crops in the fields, or making it impossible to gather enough fodder for the animals. You didn't have weather satellites or the Met-Aaron app. Your forecast came from the ache in your bones, the direction of the wind, and generations of accumulated wisdom about what different sky colors and cloud formations meant. You became a walking, talking, slightly damp weather station. Beyond just the weather, you observed the plants themselves. Were the stalks of barley thin and yellowing instead of robust and green? Were the oat heads small and sparse? Did blight appear on the leaves? Were pests like swarms of insects or rodents unusually prevalent? A healthy crop had a certain look, a certain vigor. When it was sickly, you knew something was wrong. And unlike today, where a farmer might call an agricultural extension office or spray with a complex chemical, your options were limited. You might try prayers, make offerings, or perhaps resort to charms or folk magic to ward off the perceived evil causing the problem. It was like watching your bank account dwindle, but instead of cutting back on lattes, you were praying to the rain god and hoping your magic pebbles did the trick. The animals were also crucial indicators. A healthy herd of cattle meant milk, butter, cheese, and potential meat, as well as hides and labor oxen for plowing. Sheep provided wool and occasional meat. Pigs foraged in the woods and were a source of meat. If the animals began to look thin and weak, if the cows produced little milk, if diseases swept through the herd, these were dire warnings. An epidemic among livestock could be just as catastrophic as a crop failure, sometimes worse, as animals were mobile wealth that could be traded or used to rebuild after a setback. Seeing your animals sicken and die was watching your savings literally rot away. It wasn't just sad, it was terrifying. Then there were the wild resources. People didn't rely solely on cultivated fields. They supplemented their diet with foraging, hunting, and fishing. If the usual berry patches were barren, if game animals became scarce, if the rivers yielded few fish, these were further signs that the natural world was out of balance and not in your favor. Perhaps the dry weather meant rivers were too low for fish, or the cold spring had killed off the berry blossoms. Or perhaps the animals had already been overhunted by a population desperate for food or driven away by conflict or changing environmental conditions. Losing these supplementary food sources meant even more pressure on the already stressed agricultural output. It was like your fallback plan just decided to nope out of existence. Beyond the purely ecological signals, there were social and economic indicators, subtle shifts in the fabric of community life that signaled trouble ahead. One major sign was the increase in migration. As conditions worsened in one area, people might begin to leave, seeking better prospects elsewhere. This wasn't usually a mass exodus in the early stages, but a trickle, a family moving to a relative's land in another Tuath, individuals seeking work or charity at a monastery or a wealthier lord's hall. Seeing people abandon their ancestral lands was a stark visual cue that things were bad and likely to get worse. It was the ancient equivalent of seeing for sale signs popping up all over the neighborhood, but you knew they weren't upgrading, they were escaping. Historians still argue whether formal markets with standardized prices existed in 10th century Ireland in the way they did in parts of continental Europe. However, systems of exchange and barter certainly existed. You would trade grain for milk, a sheep for labor, or pay fines and tribute in livestock or other goods. As food became scarcer, the value of staples like grain and cattle would skyrocket relative to other goods. If you noticed that it took twice as many hours of labor or 3 times as much wool to get the same measure of oats as it did last year, you knew that food was becoming dangerously expensive even for those who weren't subsistence farmers. This inflation in the value of food was a clear economic signal of impending hardship. It's like seeing the price of your favorite comfort food quadruple overnight. You know something is fundamentally wrong with the system. Another grim sign was the increase in petty crime, specifically theft of food. While raiding and cattle rustling were endemic aspects of the political landscape, A rise in individuals stealing from their neighbors' fields or storage pits indicated localized personal desperation. These weren't large-scale military actions. These were acts of quiet theft driven by hunger. Seeing someone risk severe punishment or community ostracization just to steal a few handfuls of grain or a scrawny chicken was a powerful indicator of the level of need. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking signs was a shift in community behavior and customary practices. In normal times, Irish society had complex rules of hospitality and mutual obligation, particularly within kin groups and within a tuath. As famine loomed, the bonds of community could fray under the strain. People might become less willing or able to share limited resources. Hospitality towards strangers or even distant relatives might cease. The elderly or infirm who could no longer contribute physically to the struggle for survival might be neglected or, in extreme cases, abandoned. This wasn't necessarily maliciousness. It was the brutal logic of scarcity forcing impossible choices. When helping someone else meant you and your own children might starve, ancient social contracts could break down. It was the point where looking out for number one became a matter of survival, not just selfishness. Beyond the practical observation, signs could also be interpreted through the lens of belief and superstition. Unusual natural phenomena might be seen as bad omens, warnings from the gods or spirits. A comet, a solar eclipse. The birth of deformed animals, strange lights in the sky, unexplained illnesses. All of these could be interpreted as portents of disaster, including famine. While we might dismiss these today in a world where cause and effect were often attributed to divine or supernatural forces, these signs carried immense weight. They weren't just weird events, they were messages that something was deeply wrong with the spiritual balance and that correction was needed potentially through extraordinary means. It's like getting a really creepy, nonsensical text message from a number you don't recognize. You know it's probably nothing, but a tiny part of you still wonders if it's a sign of the apocalypse. A quirky tidbit here, one historical source mentions a famine being preceded by an unusual abundance of mice. While this sounds a bit like a folktale, it could have a basis in reality. Perhaps environmental changes that harm crops like drought or flooding initially benefited rodent populations, leading to a surge before they too faced starvation. Or perhaps the stressed ecosystem was just out of whack. Either way, in the minds of the people watching this happen, a sudden explosion of vermin might very well have seemed like a terrifying omen, a sign that the natural order was collapsing. Oh, great, more mice! Is that a sign of biblical plague or just really bad hygiene? Guess we'll find out when the food runs out. The collective observation of these varied signs, the failed crops, the sickly animals, the lack of wild food, the desperate faces of neighbors, the subtle shifts in the rhythm of life, and the unnerving natural portents, created a growing sense of dread throughout the community. It wasn't just one bad harvest, it was a confluence of indicators suggesting a systemic failure, a prolonged period of scarcity, rather than a temporary setback. This cumulative anxiety, this shared understanding that the world was turning against them, was perhaps the most powerful early warning sign of all. Think about standing there in that village, the same damp air chilling you to the bone, but now you're looking at the world with newly informed eyes. You see the thin cattle grazing listlessly in the pasture. You hear the quiet conversations carrying hints of worry, talk of meager yields from the fields of neighbors who have already packed up and left. You notice the children look a little thinner, their bellies a little rounder than they should be. You see the worried glances exchanged between the adults when the conversation turns to the winter ahead. The vibrant tapestry of community life, normally filled with feasts, storytelling, and communal work, feels muted, tinged with a pervasive anxiety. This phase before the worst hunger set in was critical. It was the period when communities might take preventative action, however limited those actions might be. They might ration existing food stores more strictly. They might intensify foraging efforts, venturing further afield to find anything edible. They might appeal to more powerful lords or monasteries for aid, though aid was never guaranteed and might come with strings attached. And crucially, it was during this period of mounting dread that people might begin to consider and perhaps implement more desperate measures, including the kinds of chilling rituals we'll be exploring. These weren't acts born of sudden acute starvation, though those would also occur, but acts born of the fear of starvation, of the desperate need to avert the impending disaster that everyone could see approaching like a slow, relentless tide. The memory of past famines would also linger in the collective consciousness passed down through stories and warnings. People knew from bitter experience what awaited them if the signs proved true. They had heard tales of ancestors who had starved of communities that had been decimated. This historical memory amplified the present fear, making the signs of impending famine not just abstract observations, but portents of a very real, very terrifying future. It's like knowing your family history of being terrible parallel parkers, and every time you try to squeeze into a tight spot, that ancestral anxiety kicks in. Except you know with actual life or death stakes instead of just dented fenders. So the early warning signs of famine in 10th century Ireland were a complex mix of practical observation, ecological reading, social monitoring, and spiritual interpretation. They painted a grim picture long before the pangs of severe hunger began to bite. And it was in response to this gathering storm, this clear signal that the normal order of the world was breaking down, that people might have felt compelled to reach for extraordinary, even horrifying solutions to appease angry powers or force a change in their fortunes. The stage was set, the warning bells were ringing, and the desperation was beginning to simmer. You could see the signs, couldn't you? The sickly fields, the scrawny livestock, the nervous faces, that creeping dread we talked about. But in 10th century Ireland, seeing the signs wasn't the end of the analysis. It was the beginning of the real question. Why was this happening? Why were the crops failing? Why were the animals dying? Why was the world turning against you? You didn't have scientific explanations for blight or bovine tuberculosis or climate fluctuations. What you had was a world deeply vibrantly alive with powerful unseen forces. Your ancestors had lived for centuries with a complex tapestry of beliefs long before Christianity arrived. They saw spirits in the trees, powers in the rivers, and gods associated with the land itself, with weather, with prosperity, and with death. And even though the monks had come building their stone churches and spreading the word of Christ and his saints, the older ways didn't just vanish overnight. They mingled, they layered, they adapted. So in your mind, the reason for disaster wasn't just bad luck or poor farming techniques. It was often because something or someone out there in the spiritual realm was unhappy, angry, or simply demanding attention. Think of the land not just as dirt and rocks, but as a living entity inhabited by powerful beings. The AOC, the people of the mounds, often translated as fairies, but far more potent and terrifying than Tinkerbell. These weren't cute little sprites. These were ancient, powerful entities who shared the landscape with you. They could bring blessings, sure, but they could also be capricious, easily offended, and capable of inflicting terrible misfortune. Disturb a sacred site, cut down a tree they favored, fail to give them their due, boom. Suddenly, your milk sours your children, sicken, or the rain stops falling just when you need it most. It was like having incredibly powerful, easily annoyed neighbors who could mess with your Wi-Fi, shut off your electricity, and give your whole family the flu all with a snap of their fingers. And you didn't even know exactly where the property line was. Beyond the Alsea, there were other potent forces. Some believed in older gods whose names were perhaps whispered less often in public, but whose power over fertility, war, or death was still felt. Others might attribute misfortune to curses to malevolent spirits, or even to the wrath of a Christian saint whose shrine had been neglected or disrespected. And of course there was the big guy upstairs, the Christian God whose anger could be swift and terrible, often seen as punishing human sin with plague war or, yes, famine. A major defeat in battle, a sudden outbreak of illness, a widespread crop failure. These were often interpreted as divine judgment, a clear sign that your community, or even your king had fallen short in some way. It was like failing a pop quiz you didn't even know you were taking, and the punishment was collective starvation. So when the signs of famine began to appear, the dry wells, the withered stalks, the thin cattle, the question shifted from what's happening to who is angry and why. And if powerful unseen forces were the cause, then logic dictated that the solution must involve appeasing, placating, or otherwise influencing those forces. You had to get back in their good graces. You had to perform the right rituals, say the right words, make the right offerings. It was in a sense a form of spiritual problem solving. Your crops are failing, the spirits of the land must be angry. Better leave some milk and honey by that ancient hawthorn tree. Your cattle are sick, perhaps you haven't honored the saint associated with livestock. Time for a pilgrimage and a vow. The whole Tuath is starving. The High King must have sinned, or maybe God is punishing everyone for collective wickedness. Fasting, mass prayer, and large-scale offerings might be needed. This is where the line between daily piety and desperate ritual could blur, especially as the crisis deepened. In normal times, you'd make small offerings: a coin in a well, a scrap of cloth tied to a holy tree, a portion of your harvest dedicated to a local saint or monastery. You'd say your prayers perhaps go to church if one was nearby and accessible. But when famine loomed, the stakes were raised dramatically. Small offerings and routine prayers might no longer feel sufficient to avert catastrophe. You needed to demonstrate greater devotion, make bigger sacrifices, perform more potent rituals. The fear in your belly translated directly into a willingness to go further, to give up more, to try things that might otherwise seem extreme. One common approach was making vows. You might promise a saint, or perhaps an older power associated with healing or fertility, that if the famine ended, you would undertake a difficult pilgrimage fast for a certain period, or donate a valuable item. These vows were often made in the desperate hope that this promised future devotion would earn you immediate relief. It was like promising your parents you'll clean your room every day for a month if they just let you go to that party tonight. The desperation fueled the ambitiousness of the promise. Another form of appeasement involved increased offerings, moving beyond the symbolic. This could mean offering a greater portion of the meager food you had left, pouring precious milk or ale onto the ground at a sacred spot, or even sacrificing a healthy animal when every animal was a lifeline. This was the ultimate act of trust or desperation, giving up something vital, now in the hope that it would ensure survival, breer later. Imagine being down to your last few cans of beans and your spiritual advisor tells you to bury one of them in the garden to please the earth spirits. You'd have to be truly terrified, truly convinced to do it. Pilgrimages to sacred sites, often associated with powerful saints or ancient pre-Christian powers, would also increase during times of crisis. You would travel sometimes for days or weeks, enduring hardship to pray at a holy well-known for its healing properties, or a mountain associated with a powerful deity or saint. The journey itself was an act of penance and devotion, demonstrating your sincerity and suffering to the powers you were trying to appease. You'd arrive exhausted, hungry, but hopeful, performing specific rituals at the site, walking sunwise around it, leaving offerings, praying for deliverance from the famine. Communal prayers and fasting became more widespread. The Christian clergy would lead services, begging for God's mercy and an end to the suffering. People would collectively abstain from food, not just as a form of penance, but perhaps also in the grim practicality of conserving dwindling supplies, framed within a spiritual context. Fasting was seen as a way to purify oneself and make one's prayers more potent, showing God or the saints how truly desperate and repentant you were. It was a way for the entire community to say, "Okay, we get it. We messed up. Please stop now." Sometimes the appeasement rituals were more unusual, blending Christian and older traditions in ways that might look strange to modern eyes. You might see people performing actions at ancient standing stones while also praying the Paternoster. Offerings might be left at holy wells dedicated to Christian saints, but the well itself might have been a place of worship for millennia. Historians still argue whether the people performing these blended rituals saw a clear distinction between the Christian and pre-Christian elements, or whether they simply drew upon the full range of spiritual resources available to them in a time of need. Were they praying to Saint Bridget and the spirit of the well, or was Bridget simply the new patron of an ancient sacred spot? The truth was probably complex and varied from person to person and place to place. A quirky tidbit involves the potential role of the Fili, the poets, and learned individuals who preserved traditional knowledge. While Christianity was ascendant, the Fili still held influence, especially in matters related to the land and its ancient powers. Some scholars suggest that during times of ecological crisis like famine, people might turn to the Fili for guidance on how to appease older non-Christian forces they believed were responsible, perhaps performing rituals that predated the arrival of the monks. It's like if your Wi-Fi is down, you call the official support line, but you also secretly call your grandpa, who knows weird tricks with aluminum foil that sometimes work. These appeasement efforts weren't just about prayer and offerings. They were deeply embedded in the social and political structure. Kings and lords who were seen as having a special relationship with the land and its prosperity often led communal rituals or made significant offerings on behalf of their people. If a king was perceived as impious or ineffective in dealing with a famine, perhaps by failing to appease the right powers, his authority could be weakened, and he might face challenges to his rule. The health of the land and the people was seen as a reflection in part of the righteousness and efficacy of the ruler. So a king desperately trying to end a famine wasn't just being humanitarian, he was fighting for his legitimacy, maybe even his life. The intensity and nature of these appeasement rituals would escalate with the severity of the famine. As food became scarcer and starvation loomed closer, the desperation grew, and the willingness to make extreme sacrifices or try unconventional rituals increased. If the gods or spirits weren't listening to your prayers and milk offerings, maybe they needed something more significant. This is the psychological slippery slope that could potentially lead to the darkest rituals, the kind we'll explore later. When basic survival is on the line, the rules of what is permissible, what is unthinkable, can begin to bend. You'd be participating in this, wouldn't you? Joining the hushed, anxious crowd, gathering at the ancient standing stone circle at dawn, the mist clinging to the ground, the air cold and damp. You'd watch as someone, perhaps the local priest, perhaps an older person who remembered the ancient ways, perhaps both, performed actions you didn't fully understand, chanting words that felt heavy with history and desperate hope. You'd feel the collective anxiety radiating from the people around you, the shared fear, and the shared yearning for relief. You'd add your small offering to the growing pile, a handful of precious grain, a simple woven band, a smooth stone you carried from your farm. You'd pray with all your might to God, to the Virgin Mary, to St. Patrick, and perhaps, just perhaps, in a quiet corner of your heart, to whatever ancient power might still linger in the stones themselves. You weren't just going through the motions. You were pouring every ounce of your fear and hope into these actions, trying to tip the cosmic scales back in your favor. The belief that famine was a spiritual problem, requiring a spiritual solution, was deeply ingrained. It provided a framework for understanding the disaster and, crucially, a prescribed set of actions to take in response. It offered a sense of agency in the face of overwhelming forces. If the powers were angry, you could try to make them happy. If they were punishing sin, you could repent. If they needed tribute, you could offer it. This worldview, while perhaps mystifying to modern sensibilities, was a rational response within the context of their understanding of the world. It gave them something to do when the fields were barren and their bellies empty away, to explain the inexplicable suffering and hope, however faintly, for a return to normalcy. It was the ancient equivalent of checking every fuse, rebooting the router, and calling tech support, all while also rubbing your lucky charm. You covered all the bases, seen and unseen. The transition from these relatively conventional acts of appeasement to more chilling rituals would happen gradually, driven by the increasing severity of the famine and the failure of the initial efforts. If prayers, fasting, and standard offerings didn't work, if the hunger persisted, then clearly the powers were still not satisfied. Something more was needed, something harder to give, something more desperate. And that growing desperation, fueled by starvation and the perceived failure of traditional appeasement, is what could push people towards acts that seem horrific to us today. The logic was simple if terrifying. If the standard price wasn't enough, you had to pay a higher one. The air grew thinner, didn't it? Not just metaphorically, but it felt like the very oxygen was being rationed, just like the food. You prayed, you fasted, you walked miles to a holy well, tying your little scrap of cloth to the branch, murmuring your pleas. You left milk, honey, handfuls of precious oats where the wise woman told you the AOC might see it. The priests led mass, their voices hoarse with supplication, begging the Christian God for mercy. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and still the rain didn't come when it was needed, or it came as a torrential downpour that washed away what little soil remained. The blight didn't lift from the potatoes. Okay, maybe not potatoes, they weren't there yet. But you get the idea. The grain, the root vegetables, whatever was your staple. The cattle grew weaker, their ribs showing starkly under their hides, their eyes dull with suffering. The children's bellies began to swell, a terrible, heartbreaking sign of starvation. The standard methods hadn't worked. The cosmic scales hadn't tipped back in your favor. This is where the fear really curdled into something else. Despair, a cold, hollow emptiness that mirrored the one in your gut. When your belly is aching with hunger, when your children are crying from weakness, your mind starts to work differently. The boundaries of what is acceptable, what is unthinkable, begin to blur and shift. Rationality, at least as we understand it today, takes a back seat to the primal urge to survive and the desperate hope that something can still be done. If the gentle nudges didn't work, maybe a forceful shove was needed. If polite requests were ignored, perhaps a scream would get attention. Think about it. You believed fundamentally that powerful forces controlled your fate. You had followed the established protocols for appeasing them, the prayers, the offerings, the vows, and they had failed. What does that tell you? Either the powers are incredibly angry, incredibly indifferent, or what you offered wasn't nearly enough. And if it wasn't enough, what would be? This is the terrifying question that would begin to whisper in the dark corners of your mind, amplified by the gnawing hunger and the pervasive sense of doom. The whispers would start, wouldn't they? Quietly at first between worried neighbors and hushed tones after the meager evening meal that left everyone still wanting. Maybe the old ways need stronger offerings. What if Saint Bridget isn't listening? Maybe it's an older power that needs to be honored. They say in the next Tuath, they tried this. The this would be something just a little bit outside the norm. Something that made your stomach clench even more than hunger did. Something that felt ancient, potent, possibly dangerous. These weren't necessarily organized, universally accepted rituals yet. They were often localized, desperate experiments born of fear and desperation, sometimes rooted in older folklore, sometimes perhaps conjured out of sheer frantic invention. The line between piety and magic, between seeking divine favor and attempting to compel supernatural intervention, could become very fine indeed. When prayer failed, you might start considering charm spells or acts that felt less like supplication and more like a demand. One direction the escalation could take was increasing the value of the offering. We talked about giving up precious milk or grain, but as the famine bit harder, what became most valuable? Life itself, perhaps. The life of a precious animal, even the last one you had. There are accounts scattered and often debated by historians of animals being sacrificed, not just as offerings of food to priests or the poor, but in ritualistic ways intended to appease spiritual forces directly. Imagine your family is down to one scrawny cow, your only hope for milk or eventual meat. And the pressure builds, from fear, from community belief, maybe even from local leaders, that this last desperate offering is the only thing that might turn the tide. The act of taking that vital life, not for food now, but for spiritual effect later, would be agonizing. It's the ultimate gamble, putting your last chip on a deeply uncertain outcome. It's like selling your car, your last means of getting around to buy a single expensive lottery ticket. Another path involved pushing boundaries related to the land and sacred sites. We mentioned leaving offerings at holy wells or ancient trees. But what if those places needed more direct interaction? What if they needed something taken from them or something done to them in a way that felt transgressive? For instance, folklore sometimes mentions acts intended to compel the land itself to yield or to force reluctant spirits to release their hold on fertility. These might involve actions performed at night or during specific potent times like the solstices or cross-quarter days, but with a desperate edge they wouldn't have in normal times. They could involve disturbing ancient burial mounds, which were often associated with the AOC, or performing rites that mimicked acts of creation or destruction in a symbolic attempt to restart the cycle of abundance. Sometimes the desperation manifested in acts of public penance or displays of suffering that went beyond simple fasting. Walking barefoot over harsh ground, self-flagellation, though this was perhaps less common in 10th century Ireland than elsewhere later, or undertaking exceptionally arduous pilgrimages, weren't just about demonstrating piety. They were about inflicting suffering upon oneself in the hope that this sacrifice, this pain, would be deemed sufficient by the punishing powers. It was a grim logic. We are suffering, see, is this enough? Have we paid the price now? It's like deciding that the standard apology wasn't enough, so you have to grovel, maybe even hurt yourself a little just to show you're really sorry. The psychological aspect of this escalation is crucial. Starvation doesn't just weaken the body, It messes with the mind. It can induce hallucinations, warp judgment, and amplify emotions like fear and desperation to unbearable levels. In a community gripped by mass suffering and fear with traditional authorities, perhaps struggling to provide answers or relief, the doors open for more extreme beliefs and practices to take hold. People become more susceptible to radical ideas, more willing to follow charismatic figures who claim to know the true way to appease the powers, no matter how unsettling their methods might seem. A quirky or fringe tidbit here relates to the concept of the hungry ghost in some folklore traditions, though perhaps not strictly Irish. The idea resonates. The absolute consuming hunger could lead to beliefs that the starving living were becoming akin to restless, unsatisfied spirits, inhabiting a liminal space between life and death. Rituals might emerge aimed at preventing the living from becoming these hungry ghosts. Or conversely, sometimes rituals might even involve trying to tap into that raw, desperate energy. It's a grim thought that the very state of starving might be seen as a pathway to interacting with the supernatural, though not a pleasant one. Historians still argue whether some of the most extreme accounts of rituals during times of famine or plague reflect actual widespread practices or were exaggerations or propaganda. Some monastic chroniclers writing after the fact might have had an interest in portraying the desperation of the time, in stark terms perhaps to emphasize the need for spiritual reform or the dangers of straying from Christian orthodoxy. Were these the actions of a few individuals or small isolated groups driven to the absolute edge, or did they represent a broader, albeit temporary, shift in communal behavior? It's hard to say definitively from the limited and often biased sources available. It's like trying to understand a riot based only on tweets from two opposing sides and a single sensationalist newspaper headline. However, the potential for escalation was rooted in the belief system. If divine or supernatural anger caused the famine and standard prayers and offerings failed, then logic demanded a more potent form of appeasement. This could lead to considering things that were normally taboo or forbidden, acts that pushed against the social norms, the legal codes, and perhaps even the deepest human instincts for preservation and compassion. Consider the Philly again, those learned poets and keepers of tradition. While Christian clergy were focused on God and the saints, the Philly held knowledge of older gods, nature spirits, and potent magic. In times of extreme crisis, people might bypass the Christian priests who seemed unable to help and turn to the Philly for guidance rooted in pre-Christian beliefs. This could involve rituals focused on the raw forces of nature, the earth, and the cycles of life and death, which might require acts far more primal and potentially disturbing than those sanctioned by the church. It's like when your computer crashes and the official tech support just reads scripted solutions that don't work. So you dig out that old instruction manual from the 90s that has weird workarounds nobody uses anymore. But maybe, just maybe one of them will do something. This descent into more extreme rituals wasn't a sudden leap. It was a slippery slope greased by hunger and fear. Each failed prayer, each withered stalk, each crying child was another step down. What seemed unthinkable a month ago, say sacrificing the last breeding cell, might seem like a necessary, albeit terrible gamble today. And what seemed unthinkable today, well, tomorrow might bring even greater desperation. A mainstream historical fact to consider is that throughout history in many different cultures, facing existential threats like famine or plague, there are accounts of people resorting to extreme measures including human sacrifice, cannibalism, or the destruction of vital resources driven by despair or radical beliefs. While evidence for widespread systemic chilling rituals involving human sacrifice in 10th century Ireland, specifically linked directly to famine appeasement, is debated and thin on the ground. Remember the PG-13 constraint and the scholarly debate the psychological conditions that could lead to such acts elsewhere in the world were certainly present in a starving society. The Irish context had its unique blend of spiritual beliefs, but the human capacity for desperate acts under extreme duress is a chilling constant across time and culture. You see it in siege situations, in lifeboat scenarios, and yes, in famines. So you are in this community, the hunger a constant ache, the fear a suffocating blanket. You see the traditional ways failing. You hear the whispers about more potent acts. You feel the collective despair. The air crackles with a dark, desperate energy. And the question hangs heavy: how far are you willing to go? What are you willing to do or allow to be done to bring back the rain, to make the land yield, to save your children? This psychological transition, this breaking down of normal moral and social barriers under the immense pressure of starvation and perceived spiritual abandonment, is the fertile ground from which the most chilling rituals could potentially emerge. It's the moment where the prayers might stop and the incantations, or something far older, might begin. You might find yourself staring at an ancient standing stone, not just seeing it as a landmark, but feeling its immense silent power and wondering what it would take to awaken it to demand its help. You might look at the last weak calf not just as future food, but as the ultimate offering. You might even look at yourself or your family and ponder the unthinkable sacrifices that desperation could demand. This wasn't just about being hungry, it was about being utterly convinced that your world was ending unless you could somehow force the unseen powers to intervene, and realizing that the cost of that intervention might be higher than you could ever have imagined. The seeds of truly chilling acts were sown in the barren, unforgiving soil of utter despair. You felt the weight of it, didn't you? That gnawing sense that the gentle requests, the polite offerings, they just weren't cutting it. It was like trying to bribe a cosmic bully with a handful of wildflowers when they were demanding your lunch money, and your homework. The gods or the spirits or the very fabric of reality seem to be playing hardball. And when you're starving, when the future looks like a skeletal hand reaching out of the earth, you start to consider playing hardball back. Or more accurately, offering up something so significant, so fundamentally valuable, that it must command attention. The escalation wasn't just about doing more of the same prayers or scattering more grain. It was about increasing the potency of the offering, moving up the perceived scale of value. You'd already given precious milk, maybe some meager crops. Then perhaps it was your last bit of honey, something incredibly difficult to come by. Then as the hunger deepened and the despair tightened its grip, the whispers would turn to the animals. Not just offering a sick lamb hoping it might recover, or giving a portion of meat after slaughter. No, this was about deliberate ritualistic sacrifice of healthy, vital animals. Your breeding so the one meant to provide piglets and sustenance for months to come. Your best cow, the one giving what little milk was still flowing. The finest horse, not just a beast of burden, but a creature of status and power. Imagine the scene. The community gathered, faces gaunt and etched with fear. The chosen animal, perhaps garlanded in a way that feels disturbingly like preparation for a festival, stands trembling. The air isn't just cold from hunger, it's thick with dread. The local leader, or perhaps a figure steeped in older lore, performs acts that feel ancient and heavy with meaning. The shedding of that animal's blood wasn't for food, not immediately anyway. It was meant to water the barren earth, to appease a wrathful sky, to demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that you were willing to give up everything. It was the ultimate animal lottery ticket, praying that this single terrible act would unlock the cosmic jackpot of rain and fertile soil. But what happens when even the sacrifice of your most prized animal yields nothing? When the clouds remain stubbornly empty, or the blight clings tighter to the remaining plants? The silence from the heavens or the earth is deafening. It confirms the terrifying suspicion even that wasn't enough. The price was higher. This is where the mind goes to truly dark places. If animal life, even the most valuable, holds no sway, what is left? What is the single most precious thing in your world? It's human life, isn't it? Your own or the lives of those you love, or perhaps the life of someone designated by fate or circumstance. The idea wouldn't burst fully formed into the community consciousness. It would seep in like groundwater poisoning a well. Whispers in the dark, desperate interpretations of ancient myths, the twisted logic of extreme suffering. They say in the old times, for the greatest curses, the earth demanded blood. Or perhaps a charismatic, starving individual, driven mad by hunger and fear, might seize on an old piece of folklore and twist it into a horrifying proposal. The land is thirsty. Only the purest water, the deepest offering, will slake it. There are accounts, often vague and controversial within historical records and folklore from various cultures across the world, facing similar catastrophes where the unthinkable was considered or even acted upon. While evidence for widespread organized human sacrifice as a standard famine ritual in 10th century Ireland specifically is something historians still debate, whether it was a common practice or isolated desperate acts, the psychological pathway to such a thought process under these conditions is chillingly clear. When everything else has failed, the most extreme option looms a terrifying final gamble. It's like being in a crashing plane and looking at the parachutes, then looking at the cargo door and thinking, maybe if we just throw that out. Utter desperate, irrational thinking driven by panic. The contemplation of such a sacrifice would tear a community apart internally. Imagine the arguments, the horror, the revulsion warring with the desperate hope. Parents clutching their children tighter. People looking at their neighbors with a new terrible fear. Who would be chosen? Why? What ancient sign? What twisted omen would point the finger? Would it be the weakest, the strongest, the most innocent, the most guilty perhaps, blamed for the famine? The internal conflict, the breakdown of basic human empathy and protection under the sheer weight of starvation and terror, is arguably as horrifying as any act itself. Rituals involving the idea or threat of human sacrifice might have been more common than the act itself. Perhaps symbolic offerings were made. Effigies burned blood drawn not to kill, but as a potent token, rituals enacted that mimicked death and rebirth without claiming a life. The power might have been believed to lie in the willingness to go to that edge to demonstrate utter desperation and commitment to the unseen forces. It's like the ultimate game of chicken with the universe. Look, we are willing to do this. Are you going to let us? A quirky or fringe tidbit related to the psychological intensity of this is the concept found in some folklore traditions of sacrifice zones. Places deemed so sacred or potent that any action performed there, especially a violent or transgressive one, would have amplified effects. Imagine the pressure to perform such extreme acts not just anywhere, but at an ancient burial mound, a particularly sacred well, or a standing stone believed to be connected to primeval powers. The location itself would add to the dread and perceived potency of the ritual. You weren't just doing something terrible, you were doing it where it counted in the perceived throne room of the forces you were trying to influence. This wasn't just about appeasement, it could also become about compulsion. If the powers wouldn't listen to polite requests, perhaps they could be forced. Ancient beliefs in sympathetic magic, where imitating an action causes it to happen in the world, could take a dark turn. Rituals mimicking rainfall, pouring water, or growth-bearing seeds with something else, or fertility could become twisted. Perhaps rituals involving the tearing apart or burying of effigies, or even living things, were attempts to shock the system, to violently reset the cosmic balance, or force the Earth's fertility to return through a grim mirror image. It's a terrifying thought, that you would try to beat the famine by performing acts of destruction, hoping to jolt creation back into existence, like breaking your computer with a hammer to try and get it to turn back on. The mainstream historical fact here is that throughout human history, particularly in pre-state or early state societies, instances of human sacrifice are documented in various contexts, often linked to ensuring fertility success in war or appeasing deities during times of crisis. However, the motives, scale, and details vary wildly between cultures and periods. Applying general facts about human sacrifice elsewhere directly to famine rituals in 10th century Ireland is complex and fraught with interpretative difficulties due to the limited nature of the sources and the strong influence of later Christian writers who might sensationalize pagan practices. Historians still argue whether scattered references or archaeological finds, sometimes interpreted as evidence of human sacrifice during this period in Ireland, are definitive proof of it being a response specifically to famine, or if they relate to other practices like warfare kingship, inauguration, or criminal execution, or are simply misinterpretations of the evidence altogether. The sources are often written centuries later, colored by the biases of the Christian authors who viewed earlier pagan practices with condemnation. So while the idea of such an extreme sacrifice makes a kind of horrifying sense in the context of utter despair and belief in powerful, capricious forces, solid, unambiguous proof that it was a common famine ritual is elusive. It's like trying to prove Bigfoot exists based solely on blurry photos and whispered stories. The possibility is intriguing and scary, but the evidence isn't conclusive. The psychological toll of even contemplating such acts cannot be overstated. The fear of the famine itself was immense, but the fear of what you or your community might be driven to do was perhaps even greater. It stained the soul, eroded trust, and left deep scars, even if the worst acts were never carried out. The air wasn't just thin, it felt poisoned by the proximity to the ultimate taboo. Every glance exchanged between neighbors held a hidden question. Are you thinking it too? Could we? And in the darkest moments when the hunger gnawed relentlessly and the wails of hungry children echoed in the empty houses, the terrifying logic of ultimate sacrifice could gain a foothold. It was the final desperate card to play a horrifying negotiation with powers that seemed indifferent to lesser suffering. The slide from praying for rain to contemplating shedding blood on sacred ground is a descent into a nightmare driven by the most primal urge, survival, and the deepest fear, the loss of everything. It's the point where hope transforms into a monstrous shape. You step back from the edge of that horrifying thought, that ultimate unspeakable act. Maybe your community did. Maybe the sheer gut-wrenching revulsion was too much to overcome, even in the face of absolute desperation. Or maybe even if it was contemplated, it didn't work. The sky remained empty, the ground hard, and you're left with the chilling realization that the cosmic price tag might be infinite. Or perhaps you just hadn't found the right currency. But the urge to do something remains a frantic, buzzing need in your skull. Sitting by and simply starving feels like a surrender that is somehow worse than fighting even against invisible forces. If the gods or the spirits or the hungry earth didn't want blood, or maybe you just couldn't bring yourself to give it, what else was there? What else held profound value? Possessions. Objects imbued with meaning, with history, with crafted effort. Your grandmother's brooch, the one that had been in the family for generations. A finely made tool, the product of someone's skill and time. A weapon, something that represented power and protection. These things weren't food, but they held a different kind of weight. Bearing them felt like a potent act. It wasn't just hiding them. It was giving them, entrusting them to the earth, hoping they might act as a silent plea, a bribe, a deposit on future prosperity. Imagine the quiet, grim procession to a sacred spot, a deep well, a dark pool in the bog, a lonely standing stone. Remember those from earlier, clutching a wrapped bundle of your meager treasures. The air is still and cold, the only sounds the crunch of your footsteps on frozen ground and the ragged breaths of those around you. You kneel the earth hard beneath your knees, perhaps scraping them. You dig a shallow hole, the soil resisting, as if reluctant to accept your offering. You place the object inside, maybe whispering a prayer, maybe just a desperate plea into the dirt. As you cover it, you feel a tiny flickering spark of hope instantly almost extinguished by the crushing reality of your empty stomach and the barren landscape around you. It's like bearing a time capsule, except you're not sending a message to the future. You're trying to send one to the present, to the powers you believe control it, saying, "See, we are giving up even this. Please listen." It felt like a form of negotiation. You were showing commitment. Look, we're not just asking idly. We're putting skin in the game, well metal and bone, and crafted wood in the ground. It was less visceral than the thought of shedding blood, but perhaps just as heartbreaking in its own way. These objects represented your identity, your history, your ability to survive and function in the world. Giving them up was another layer of stripping yourself bare, demonstrating utter reliance on the unseen. But perhaps the most desperate, ironic offering of all was the burial of food itself. Not eating the precious grain, but burying it. Taking the last handfuls of seed corn, the stuff that could have been planted next season, or even ground into a tiny, meager meal, and instead consigning it to the earth in a ritual act. The logic is heartbreakingly twisted. You give the earth the very thing you need from it, hoping that by doing so, you demonstrate such profound need and trust that it must respond by providing abundance. It's like giving your last drop of water to a dry well, praying it will somehow become full again. Historians still argue whether specific hoards of objects found buried in bogs or under stones in Ireland from this period were primarily religious offerings tied to fertility and appeasement during crises like famine, or if they were simply caches hidden for safekeeping during times of warfare and instability. The truth is probably a messy blend of both. When your world is falling apart, the line between hiding your wealth and offering it to the gods gets pretty blurry. You might be doing both simultaneously, hedging your bets with the visible and invisible world. A quirky or fringe tidbit in this context is the concept of hungry ghosts, or spirits who were themselves suffering and needed to be appeased, not with offerings of food, which they might be unable to consume in a physical sense, but with non-material wealth or symbolic gestures. Perhaps burying cherished items wasn't just for the high gods, but for the restless, starving spirits of the land, or the ancestors who in their own suffering might be withholding fertility out of a twisted form of cosmic envy or pain. Imagine trying to negotiate with a spiritual realm populated by beings as desperate and hungry as you are. It adds a layer of cosmic horror to the whole situation. And then there were the effigies. If you couldn't sacrifice a person, maybe you could sacrifice their image. If you couldn't control the famine directly, maybe you could control its representation. Effigies made of straw, of cloth, of clay. What did they represent? Sometimes perhaps they were meant to represent the desired outcome. A fat cow, a pregnant sow, stalks heavy with grain. These might be treated with reverence, buried gently in the soil, in a ritual of sympathetic magic, hoping to encourage the real thing to follow. It's like burying a picture of a winning lottery ticket under your pillow. Other times, the effigies represented the problem. The famine itself, the blight, the angry spirit causing the suffering. These effigies would be treated with violence and contempt. Burned, torn apart, perhaps beaten, and then buried in a bad place, far from the fertile fields you hope to restore. The ritual would be one of banishment, of trying to physically drive away the hunger by destroying its symbolic form. It's like making a voodoo doll of your financial problems and then setting it on fire, which, let's be honest, probably feels pretty good in the moment, even if it doesn't pay the bills. There's a dark humor in the sheer illogical desperation of it all. You're starving, literally fading away, and you're spending your last ounce of energy and what little resources you have making straw dolls or burying shiny pebbles. It's like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon, but believing with all your might that the teaspoon is magic. The jokes, if any were made, would have been gallows humor, thin and sharp, as starving ribs aimed perhaps at the futility of their own actions. Well, that straw man of the blight looked pretty convincing before we burned him. Guess the real one didn't get the memo. Or maybe the earth spirits prefer bronze over gold, should have buried my good torque instead of this old one. The mainstream historical fact here is that votive offerings, the practice of dedicating objects or wealth to deities or spirits, is a widespread phenomenon across many ancient and traditional cultures, including those of Iron Age and early medieval Ireland. Bogs and bodies of water were often seen as liminal spaces connected to the spirit world, and archaeological finds of artifacts, sometimes quite valuable in these locations, are often interpreted as ritual deposits or offerings. These rituals, bearing objects or effigies, were likely public communal events. You needed the collective belief, the shared performance to give them power. As you stood there watching the last bit of grain disappear into the cold earth, surrounded by your equally hungry neighbors, you weren't just performing a personal act of desperation. You were participating in a collective scream into the void, a communal act of faith and fear. The shared vulnerability, the mutual understanding of the impossible choice being made, forged a different kind of bond, a grim solidarity born of shared suffering and shared desperate hope. The psychological effect of these rituals was complex. On one hand, they provided a sense of agency. You weren't just passively waiting to die, you were doing something. You were attempting to influence the forces that seemed to control your fate. This could be incredibly important for maintaining morale and preventing complete societal collapse. On the other hand, if the rituals failed, and they often did because magic isn't a reliable agricultural strategy, the failure could deepen the despair, reinforce the sense of powerlessness, and potentially lead to even more extreme measures, bringing you right back to the horrifying thoughts from the end of the last section. The constant cycle of hope and crushing disappointment fueled by these increasingly desperate rituals must have been soul-destroying. You put all your faith, all your dwindling resources into bearing that precious item or burning that effigy. You waited, you watched the sky, you checked the fields, and nothing. The silence of the universe, the indifference of nature felt like a personal rebuke. It wasn't just a failed ritual. It was proof that your suffering didn't matter, that your desperate pleas were unheard or ignored. And so the brainstorming, the desperate search for some action that would break the famine's grip continued. If bribing the earth with treasures didn't work, and bearing symbolic seed didn't bring growth, and banishing straw effigies of the blight didn't make it disappear, what was left, you'd given up possessions considered giving up life. Where else could you turn? The answer perhaps lay not in giving things to the earth, but in trying to understand or manipulate the deeper unseen forces at play, forces that might demand a different kind of interaction entirely. So the treasures are buried, the last handfuls of seed corn are returned to the unyielding soil, the straw effigies are burned or beaten into dust. And still the gut clenches with emptiness. The air bites with a cold that feels personal, and the landscape remains a study in brown and gray. The desperate hope kindled by those rituals has flickered out, leaving only the stark, persistent reality of hunger. That sickening realization washes over you. It wasn't enough. It didn't work. The unseen forces are still indifferent, or perhaps actively hostile. Where do you turn now if appeasement and symbolic gestures have failed, if even contemplating the ultimate sacrifice felt futile or impossible? The mind starts grasping for other explanations, other targets. Maybe the problem isn't your lack of offerings, but an active malevolence directed towards you, towards your community. Someone or something is causing this. This is where the whispers start. Quiet at first, then growing louder, fueled by fear and starvation. Someone is holding back the bounty. Someone has angered the spirits in a way that your communal rituals can't fix. Someone perhaps is actively working against you. The blame needs to land somewhere, anywhere, to give the despair a focal point, a tangible enemy to fight. It's like when your internet goes down and you immediately blame the router, even though it's probably the provider or a squirrel chewing a cable somewhere down the road. It just feels better to have something to point at and mutter darkly about. Perhaps it's a person, someone in the community who harbored a secret grievance, who spoke ill of the land spirits, who practiced forbidden magic. Or maybe it's someone outside a rival clan, a distant enemy, whose curses are reaching across the barren fields. This isn't just abstract fear anymore. It's a need to identify and isolate the source of the suffering, to purify the community by rooting out the perceived rot. Rituals of purification and banishment become more prominent. Not just banishing the famine spirit as an abstract concept, but banishing the suspected cause. This could involve accusing individuals, subjecting them to trials by ordeal, though those are more often associated with legal disputes in a time of extreme crisis. Boundaries blur, or even physically driving them out of the community. The logic is brutal in its simplicity. If they are the source of the blight, removing them must remove the blight. Or maybe the target isn't a person, but the unyielding land itself. You've begged it, you've bribed it, you've returned your most precious possessions to its depths, and it hasn't given back. The frustration builds a bitter resentment towards the very earth that should sustain you. This can manifest in chilling rituals of cursing the land. Not appealing to it, but confronting it, demanding it yield its bounty. Imagine a group hollow-eyed and gaunt standing at the edge of a field that should be greening, but is hard and fallow. Instead of prayers for fertility, they might utter imprecations, curses directed at the soil, at the rocks, at the very spirit of the land that seems to have turned its face away. It's a reversal of the earlier supplicating rituals. You are no longer a humble petitioner. You are a desperate, angry child yelling at an unresponsive parent. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this is the concept of poetic cursing in early Irish society, which wasn't just about rhyming insults, though those could be potent, but about using the power of language, particularly the structured ancient language of poets' folly, to invoke supernatural forces to bring about specific outcomes, including blight or misfortune upon enemies or unwilling patrons. Could this highly specialized, respected skill of the poets have been turned in desperation against the land itself, or the unseen beings thought to control it? The idea of revered figures using their powerful words not to bless the harvest, but to demand it through supernatural threat is a fascinating and dark twist. The curses might involve symbolic acts of violence against the land, striking the ground, spitting on it, scattering ashes or waste instead of seed. It's an act of ultimate disrespect, a desperate gamble that perhaps the land spirits are like petulant children who only respond to harsh discipline, or like stubborn animals that need to be beaten into submission. It's a terrifying escalation, born of absolute powerlessness. If you can't gently coax the harvest, maybe you can shock the system into producing it. Historians still argue whether the practice of cursing land or specific locations was a widely accepted part of famine ritual, or if it represented a breakdown of traditional, more reverent practices, a sign of the sheer desperate chaos that the famine induced. Were these curses performed by sanctioned community leaders, or were they spontaneous, frantic acts of individuals or desperate fringes? The archaeological record is silent on audible curses, but the shift in buried offerings, perhaps from valuable items to broken killed objects or the treatment of certain sites, might offer subtle clues. These rituals of cursing or banishment were dangerous not just socially if you wrongly accused someone or angered a powerful spirit, but psychologically. They required a fundamental shift in mindset from respect and supplication to anger and confrontation. It's like deciding that since your houseplant isn't growing, you're going to start yelling at it and hitting it with a spoon. It probably won't help the plant, and it definitely says something concerning about your own state of mind. Beyond cursing, the search for new magical interventions might focus on elemental forces directly. If the earth is barren, maybe you need to appeal to the sky for rain, or the wind to carry away the blight, or the waters for fertility. Rituals at wells, rivers, or lakes might increase in frequency and intensity. Remember those liminal spaces where objects were buried? They might now be sites for more active, performative magic. Perhaps you gather at the edge of a dark, still bog. Instead of bearing treasures, you might be trying to draw something out. Power, fertility, even food. Maybe offerings of blood, this time perhaps animal blood, or even self-mutilation for symbolic blood are made directly to the bog, a place often associated with otherworldly beings and hidden power. The air here is heavy, the silence broken only by the calls of unseen birds. You feel a deep, ancient chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. It feels like you're standing on the threshold of another world, and you're banging on the door demanding help. The desperation breeds innovation, albeit of a frantic, undirected kind. People would share stories, heard from travelers remembered from old tales, perhaps born purely of the fever dreams of starvation, about rituals performed elsewhere in different times that supposedly ended blights or brought back the harvest. You'd try anything. You'd hear that spitting on a specific type of stone at dawn while facing east and reciting a forgotten rhyme brought rain 2 generations ago in a far-off county, and you'd gather everyone who could still stand and try it. You'd have 3 people facing slightly the wrong way, someone coughing through the rhyme, and the stone might not even be the right type, but you'd do it anyway. Because doing something, no matter how illogical, felt better than doing nothing. It's the same reason people click on those weird internet ads promising you can make $1 million from home with one simple trick. When you're desperate, any crack of perceived light looks like a way out. The jokes that survive from such a time, if any did, would be incredibly dark perhaps about the absurdity of their own actions. Well, we spat on the stone, and all it did was get slightly wetter. Still no rain. Or, we banished Old Man Khan off into the hills, and the crops are still dead. Guess it wasn't him or his bad jokes. Seriously, if you're facing famine, the last thing you need is someone telling dad jokes, Khan. This escalation of ritual from polite request to desperate bribe to angry demand reflects the psychological toll of prolonged famine. It erodes social norms, strains community bonds, and pushes people towards actions they would never have contemplated in times of plenty. The line between piety and sorcery, between acceptable communal ritual and dangerous fringe practice becomes incredibly blurred. The wise elder whispering traditional prayers stands shoulder to shoulder with the gaunt figure muttering curses over a withered field, both driven by the same gnawing emptiness, both seeking to manipulate forces they don't understand. The shift towards blaming others or cursing the land also reflects a deeper fear that the problem wasn't something they failed to do, but something that was being done to them. It's the fear of an active, malevolent enemy, whether human or spirit. This transforms the famine from a natural disaster, albeit one interpreted through a spiritual lens, into a form of cosmic or interpersonal warfare. And in war, you fight back even if your weapons are curses and your battlefield is a barren field under an empty sky. And as these increasingly fraught rituals fail one after another, the despair deepens. The hope that flickered is now a cold ember. The well of potential actions is running dry. You've begged, you've bribed, you've cursed, you've banished. What is left when you have exhausted all the ways you know to interact with the world seen and unseen, and it still refuses to yield? The answer, tragically, might bring you back to the most primal, most terrifying considerations you tried to push away before. The desperation has a way of stripping away layers of taboo, leaving only the raw animal instinct for survival and the horrifying choices that instinct might demand. The air grows colder still, not just physically, but in your very soul. The frantic energy of the rituals, the desperate hope, the frustrated anger, it all drains away, leaving a terrifying void. You've thrown everything you had at the problem, prayers, offerings, curses, banishments, and the earth remains silent, the sky empty, the stomach hollow. There is nothing left to try within the bounds of what you know, what is considered right, what is considered human. The rules have broken down not because you chose for them to, but because the world has broken them for you. Starvation does things to the mind. It strips away politeness, then decency, then sanity. You are no longer thinking about next season's harvest, or the health of the clan, or the favor of the spirits. You are thinking minute by minute about the gnawing emptiness in your gut, the dizziness that makes the world swim, the weakness in your limbs. Your entire existence contracts to a single horrifying point: survival. Pure animal survival. And in that primal state, the deepest taboos, the ones that define you as part of a community, as a human being, begin to crumble. They are ancient walls built high by generations of custom and belief, but hunger is a relentless battering ram. You look at the world differently now. You look at everything and everyone through the lens of that unbearable need. This is the point where the unthinkable becomes thinkable, where the whisper in your own mind is more terrifying than any curse from a vengeful spirit, where the line between life and death blurs and the terrible logic of desperation takes hold. Among the most deeply ingrained taboos in any human society, none are perhaps stronger than those surrounding the sanctity of life and the handling of the dead. Eating another human being, particularly one from your own community, is universally reviled. Harming a child, particularly your own, is an act that violates the fundamental protective instinct. Yet in the absolute zero of famine, these horrors can occur. You might hear the rumors first carried on the thin, cold wind, whispers from a neighboring settlement, or a solitary survivor stumbling into your territory, their eyes wide and vacant. Tales of desperate acts of silence descending over homes of bodies handled in ways that chill the blood more than the winter air. You push them away at first. Impossible. Not here. Not us. But the seed of possibility once planted grows in the fertile ground of your own despair. The historical record regarding cannibalism during famines, particularly in periods as remote and sparsely documented as 10th century Ireland, is incredibly difficult to interpret. Accounts from later periods or other cultures are often biased, used to portray a group as barbaric. However, the sheer universality of famine leading to such extremes in many different contexts around the world suggests it wasn't an Irish-specific horror, but a human one. It's a grim mainstream historical fact that when people are starving, the most extreme measures sometimes become tragically real. Think of the Donner Party in America, or accounts from sieges throughout history. The breaking of this ultimate taboo is a recurring nightmare of human suffering. How does one even reach that point? It's not a sudden decision. It's a long, torturous descent. You try everything else first. You eat roots, bark, leather. You eat things that make you sick, things that should not be food. You watch your body waste away, your strength fail. You watch your loved ones suffer. And as their life ebbs, the unthinkable thought creeps in. It's a moment of profound horror and self-loathing, a battle between the starving animal and the last vestiges of your humanity. And sometimes under that unimaginable pressure, the animal wins. It's important to understand this is not some innate savagery. It is a monstrous act born of monstrous circumstances. It is the absolute failure of everything else, of society, of the land, of the spiritual world as you understand it, to provide sustenance. It is the final, desperate, horrifying act of survival. A joke here feels utterly misplaced, but perhaps the darkest humor lies in the cosmic indifference of it all. That the universe could push creatures to such lengths and still offer no relief. Well, the spirits didn't provide the harvest, so this is awkward, isn't it? No, there is no humor, only cold, empty despair. Infanticide is another horror that can emerge from the depths of famine. This isn't necessarily a ritual act, though some historical accounts from other cultures link child sacrifice to appeasement that's distinct from the survival motive here, but a brutal calculation born of absolute impossibility. You look at a newborn or a very young child, and you know with sickening certainty that you cannot feed them. You cannot feed yourself. The burden of their life means the death of everyone else, including you. Or in a horrifying twist, the child becomes a source of sustenance. The logic is twisted desperate and violates every fiber of parental love and protection. Historians still debate the extent to which infanticide and cannibalism occurred in early Ireland during famines. Written accounts from the time are rare and often unreliable when describing such taboo subjects, frequently using hyperbolic language to condemn enemies or illustrate moral decline. Archaeological evidence is equally ambiguous. How would one differentiate remains except in very specific, unlikely circumstances, whether accounts were literal or symbolic, or if these acts were isolated incidents born of extreme individual desperation versus something that became tragically normalized in the worst-hit communities, remains an open scholarly debate. The truth is likely hidden in the unmarked graves and the unspeakable memories that were carried by the few who survived. A quirky or fringe tidbit, though one that skirts dangerously close to the abyss, relates to the complex attitudes towards death and the body in early Irish culture. While burial practices show respect for the dead, there are also hints in mythology and folklore of the power contained within the body, particularly of enemies or significant figures. Could the absolute desperation of famine have warped any such beliefs into something grotesque? A twisted idea that consuming part of another human being, perhaps even a loved one who had just died, might somehow transfer their strength, their spirit, or simply provide the sustenance needed to survive for them. It's a chilling possibility, a horrifying intersection of spiritual belief and primal need, something usually confined to the realm of warring tribes and fallen enemies, now turned inward on the community itself. You try not to think about it. You try to avert your eyes to block your ears to the whispers, but the possibility hangs in the air, heavy and suffocating. You see the way people look at each other, the desperate hunger in their eyes that seems to look through the person, not at them. You see the silence that falls when someone dies, a silence that feels less like grief and more like a terrible shared understanding of what might happen next. The rituals of death would change too. The careful washing and preparation of the body, the keening, the communal mourning, all might be truncated or abandoned. There is no energy for elaborate ceremony, and the practicalities of survival override the customs of respect. Bodies might be buried quickly, secretly, or not at all, depending on the depth of the desperation and the community's disintegration. This isn't the dramatic open horror you might imagine. It's more insidious. It happens in the shadows behind closed doors, if doors still stand, in the quiet desperation of the night. It is accompanied by profound shame and trauma that would scar any survivors forever. It's the ultimate violation not just of another person, but of one's own self, of the social contract that holds humanity together. And yet, even in this hellscape, the urge to survive persists. Your body, a machine honed by instinct over millennia, screams at you to find energy to keep going. It's a brutal, unyielding force, more powerful than any taboo, more compelling than any moral code when faced with absolute extinction. As you stumble through this landscape of death and despair, your own body wasting away, you are confronted daily with the stark reality of what humans are capable of when pushed beyond the breaking point. The rituals of appeasement and magic seem like childish games played in a forgotten age of plenty. Now there is only the raw, terrifying business of staying alive, a business that might demand a price you could never have imagined paying. The depths of human desperation are truly unfathomable until you find yourself staring into them. That cold void that settled in after hope departed, and the deepest taboos began to fray. It leads you into a landscape where humanity itself seems to unravel. You are no longer just enduring, you are devolving. The complex social tapestry that defined your life, your role in the clan, your kinship ties, the mutual obligations that held everyone together, is fraying thread by thread. What replaces it is a raw, brutal struggle, not just against starvation, but increasingly against each other. The desperation you feel isn't a quiet, resigned sadness anymore. It's a sharp, clawing need that overrides reason. Your mind, starved of nutrients, becomes a dark, simplified place, focused only on the immediate, agonizing present. The future stretches out like an endless, empty plain. The past feels like a dream of impossible abundance. All that exists is this hollow ache, this gnawing fear. In this state, actions that were once unthinkable become grimly practical. Stealing is no longer a sin against your neighbor. It's a necessity for your survival. You might eye the pathetic scraps, others have the carefully guarded handful of grain, the wilted turnip they managed to dig up. The moral code that said, "Thou shalt not steal," feels like a relic from a time when there was actually something to steal without condemning someone else to death. You might creep out in the thin moonlight driven by the frantic hunger pains and try to snatch something, anything from someone weaker, someone less watchful. The shame that follows is a bitter aftertaste to the meager, desperate calories consumed. Violence, too, becomes a constant, low-level threat. Not the ritualized warfare of armies or the honorable combat of champions from the sagas you used to tell by the fire. This is the desperate, ugly violence born of fear and want. A fight breaks out over a withered root over the last scraps of bark stripped from a tree. Blows are exchanged with the pathetic strength you still possess, fueled by pure animalistic terror. You might see someone collapse, and the instinct to help is overridden by the chilling realization that their collapse means one less mouth to feed, perhaps even a source of something, if you could bring yourself to think that way. The dehumanization isn't just in the acts you might commit, it's in how you perceive yourself and others. You see people reduced to their most basic functions, consuming, surviving, or failing to do both. The nuances of personality, the bonds of affection, the shared history, they are luxuries the starving mind can no longer afford to process. Everyone is just another body, another competitor for scarce resources, or tragically, another potential casualty. This descent into violence and social breakdown is a grim mainstream historical fact of severe famines across cultures and time periods. When the fabric of society is stretched to breaking point by absolute scarcity, the usual rules break down. Governments lose control, community structures collapse, and individuals are often forced into desperate violent acts to survive. Think of the accounts from the Holodomor in Ukraine, the Bengal famine, or the Irish famine of the 19th century. While the specifics of rituals and beliefs differ, the underlying human response to mass starvation often includes a rise in crime, desperate theft, and inter-community conflict as resources dwindle. The 10th century in Ireland, already a period of flux with Viking raids, adding another layer of chaos, would have been particularly vulnerable to this social disintegration during a prolonged famine. Beyond outright theft and violence for food desperation can manifest in other disturbing ways. You might witness acts born of pure despair rituals that are less about appeasing spirits and more about expressing unbearable anguish or enacting twisted forms of control in a world where you have none. Perhaps someone maddened by grief and hunger tries to dig up a recently buried body, not necessarily for sustenance, though that horrifying possibility always lurks, but to reclaim a loved one, to rage against their loss, or to find some desperate token of comfort. The disrespect to the dead, normally a profound taboo, becomes another boundary blurred by the overwhelming present misery. Could there be a twisted form of ritual in this? Perhaps the desperate performance of traditional death rites, but grotesquely altered. The keener's wails become genuine screams of agony, not stylized lament. The laying out of the body might be hurried, disrespectful, driven by morbid practicality. Or perhaps new horrifying rituals emerge. Curses hurled not just at the distant, uncaring gods, but at neighbors, at those perceived to have slightly more at the dying themselves. A chilling fringe tidbit could relate to the powerful curses known as glam disen, sure, in Irish tradition, capable of causing boils, disfigurement, or even death. Normally used sparingly by poets or satirists with specific powers, perhaps starvation-maddened individuals or groups would attempt to weaponize these unleashing torrents of desperate venomous language against anyone they blame for their plight, hoping their sheer misery would lend the curses power. It's a horrifying thought that even language itself becomes a weapon wielded in the final throes of despair. Historians still debate the degree to which social order collapsed across Ireland during severe famines in this period. Was it a total breakdown in all affected areas, or were some communities able to maintain a semblance of order through shared suffering and leadership? Did violence become widespread, or was it concentrated in the most desperate pockets? Accounts are scattered and often written decades or centuries later, making it hard to distinguish between actual events and later moralizing tales used to explain past calamities or condemn certain groups. Whether desperate acts like grave desecration or widespread localized violence were common occurrences, or isolated horrors remains an open scholarly debate hidden in the silences of the historical record. You see the signs of this breakdown everywhere. Groups of gaunt figures huddled together, eyeing newcomers with suspicion or outright hostility. The paths between settlements are no longer safe for travel. You risk being robbed or worse by others as desperate as you. The cattle raids and skirmishes that were part of life before take on a new terrible urgency. Stealing livestock isn't about wealth or prestige anymore. It's about immediate life or death protein. But the herds are gone now, already consumed or dead. The violence turns inwards. Even the land itself feels violated by the desperation. Every patch of earth is scrabbled over, every root dug up, every scrap of vegetation consumed. The landscape, once a source of life and connection, is now a battlefield for survival, scarred by frantic, unproductive labor. The connection you once felt to the soil, to the nurturing earth, is replaced by a bitter resentment. It has failed you. The spirits of the land, if they exist, are silent or malevolent. Humor feels utterly alien here. A joke about finding a rogue potato would land with the terrible emptiness of a rock-hitting bone. The only possible joke might be the cosmic one you're living. The absurdity of sophisticated human beings reduced to this state, stripped of everything but the basic drive to breathe and consume if consuming were even possible. Well, I always did say I was built for comfort, not speed, but I seem to be failing at the comfort part too remarkably. No, even that rings hollow. There is no comfort, only the gnawing emptiness. As you witness or experience these acts of desperation, you feel another part of yourself wither away. The person you were before the famine, the one who knew right from wrong, who cared about reputation and community standing, who found joy in stories and songs, feels increasingly distant, like a character in a forgotten tale. Your identity contracts to the most fundamental level survivor. The bonds of family and kinship, the strongest ties you knew, are also strained to breaking point. Do parents share the last morsel equally, or does instinct scream to favor the strongest, the one with the best chance of making it through? Do siblings share or compete? These are the terrible, agonizing choices demanded by the famine choices that leave scars deeper than any physical wound on the rare chance someone survives. The rituals of everyday life, the small comforts and structures that provided meaning, sharing a meal, telling stories, working together in the fields, attending gatherings, are gone. What replaces them are the rituals of desperation, the furtive search for food, the wary glances at neighbors, the silent calculation of who is weakest, who might not make it through the night. These are not rituals of community or faith, but rituals of disintegration and fear. You might see evidence of violence against the dead beyond simple desecration for survival. Perhaps bodies are left unburied, not just out of weakness, but out of a final desperate act of rage against the world that failed them. Or perhaps something more macabre, hints of bodies being disrespected or violated in ways that speak to a complete breakdown of mental and social norms, though thankfully you are spared the most explicit horrors. Even recounting these possibilities in your mind is a dark journey, one that chills you to the bone. This period is not just about physical starvation, it's about the starvation of the soul, the erosion of empathy, the death of hope. The rituals born of this desperation are not designed to connect you to the spiritual world or your community. They are the desperate flailing actions of individuals or small groups fighting for air in a suffocating reality. They are the final terrible manifestations of a world turned upside down, where the most basic human decency is a luxury no one can afford. As you trudge onwards, you are wading through the wreckage of not just a society, but of humanity itself stripped bare by the relentless, unforgiving hunger. That cold void that settled in after hope departed and the deepest taboos began to fray. It leads you into a landscape where humanity itself seems to unravel. You are no longer just enduring, you are devolving. The complex social tapestry that defined your life, your role in the clan, your kinship ties the mutual obligations that held everyone together, is fraying thread by thread. What replaces it is a raw, brutal struggle, not just against starvation, but increasingly against each other. This was Section 9, but the echo of its horror still clings to you as you stumble forward. Because as the physical world collapses as the normal ways of getting help, from neighbors, from your chieftain, from the land itself, fail, where do you turn when you feel utterly, devastatingly powerless? You turn to desperation, and sometimes desperation wears a very dark, very old face. You turn to the whispers, the forbidden lore, the things you were warned never to meddle with. You reach for whatever invisible levers you think might still exist in a world that has otherwise abandoned you. You begin to think about curses. You begin to think about pacts. In a society where belief in the power of words of blessings and yes of curses is deeply ingrained, it's perhaps inevitable that when faced with absolute catastrophe, people would seek to weaponize that power. The curses you knew about before were serious business. There were specific formulas often tied to the power of poets, Philid, or other figures with spiritual authority. A powerful curse could blight the land, cause illness, bring misfortune. But now the desperation is so raw, so universal, that it feels like anyone, everyone, might try to tap into that dark energy. You hear mutters, whispers carried on the thin, cold wind. Someone blaming a neighbor for hoarding a handful of grain, following it with a low, venomous imprecation. May your gut twist. May your hands wither. The words are ugly, stripped of any ritualistic poetry, raw with hate and fear. You might see someone making a gesture you don't understand, spitting towards the ground near someone's dwelling, performing some small private act they hope will inflict harm on those they perceive as having wronged them, or simply those who are still alive, while their own loved ones have perished. It's the weapon of the utterly dispossessed, the desperate hope that your suffering can be transferred, that your despair can become someone else's reality. This turn towards curses isn't a sudden invention of the famine. It's an amplification of an existing belief system. The power of the spoken word for good or ill was a mainstream historical fact in ancient and medieval Irish society. Legal texts mention compensation for being cursed. Sagas recount the devastating effects of powerful curses, particularly those delivered by figures like poets or satirists who felt their honor or due was violated. The Glamdísin, mentioned previously, a public ritualistic satire intended to shame and blight its target, is perhaps the most formal example. But in the famine's grip, this becomes a free-for-all, a decentralized, desperate lashing out. Every bitter glance, every resentful murmur, every wish for ill fortune feels charged with dark potential. You clutch the small amulet you still possess, not just for general protection, but specifically against the invisible darts of malice flying through the air. Honestly, you might think with a flicker of your old dark humor, you'd think the actual famine was enough. Do people really need to add curses to the menu? It's like adding insult to death by starvation. But what about darker pacts? This is where the folklore gets truly chilling, and the reality becomes harder to untangle from the stories that might have emerged later in the retelling of such horrors. When people are dying all around you, when the land yields nothing, when the gods seem silent or absent, where else is left to turn? Perhaps to the older powers, the ones that predate the monasteries, the ones that lingered in the darker corners of the woods and the deeper parts of the bogs, or perhaps even darker forces still. The idea of making a deal a covenant of sorts for survival is a horrifying possibility born of ultimate despair. What would you offer when you have nothing left to give but yourself or your future? You might hear whispers, always whispers in times like these, of individuals trying to appease malevolent spirits of the land, Dawensido, who are feeling particularly grumpy about the state of affairs perhaps, or even darker entities entirely. These wouldn't be the benevolent or even tricky, but ultimately fair beings of the normal folklore. These would be creatures drawn to suffering, to desperation, willing to offer a temporary reprieve, a hidden store of food, a moment of warmth in exchange for what? Perhaps it's a promise of servitude, a claim on your soul, a sacrifice of something precious you no longer possess anyway. A fringe tidbit bordering on the truly macabre folklore might involve beliefs about appeasing famine spirits or hag-like entities. Kailasha Gorda. Perhaps, though the term might be later, by offering them the very thing you're trying to save, small symbolic portions of whatever meager food you find left out at night, or even more disturbing offerings. Could there be tales whispered in terrified tones of people making promises to dark forces in exchange for sustenance, sealing the pact with a drop of blood or a lock of hair, hoping to buy another day, another week at any cost? Right contract law in 10th century Ireland. You might think acidly. Article 1, you get a turnip. Article 2, your soul is forfeit. Seems like a fair negotiation. These aren't the structured communal rituals of happier times. These potential pacts would be secretive solitary acts born of shame and terror. You wouldn't boast about making a deal with a shadow. You would hide it the secret, a heavy cold stone in your gut. You might see someone disappear into the woods for hours, returning with a haunted look in a small, unidentifiable bundle. Or you might find strange markings near someone's dwelling, symbols you don't recognize, etched into the frozen ground or carved into a withered tree. Attempts at protection, perhaps, or signs of a desperate appeal to forces that shouldn't be named. Historians still debate the extent to which such truly dark, pact-like rituals were practiced during the famine. While the power of curses is well documented as a belief, actual deals with the devil or their pre-Christian equivalents are much harder to prove. Accounts from this period are often vague, filtered through later Christian perspectives that might have interpreted desperate acts or remnants of older beliefs through a lens of demonic influence. Were these pacts literal attempts to commune with malevolent entities, or were they symbolic acts born of psychological breakdown and utter despair given weight and terror in the terrified retelling? Was it widespread or limited to the most desperate, isolated individuals driven mad by hunger? The historical record is tantalizingly silent on the specifics, leaving it an open scholarly debate whether widespread, deliberate dark pacts were a common feature of famine survival, or a terrifying legend born from the overall horror and breakdown of norms. You feel the pervasive fear of these hidden acts. Even if you don't believe in curses or dark pacts yourself, and honestly you're too tired and hungry to engage in theological or magical debates right now, the belief of others creates a palpable atmosphere of suspicion and dread. Everyone is a potential threat, not just physically, but spiritually. Is that person who seems to be faring slightly better secretly cursed? Did they make a deal? The paranoia feeds on itself, further isolating individuals at a time when unity is most needed. The landscape itself seems to mirror this turn toward the sinister. The familiar fields and woods that once felt comforting now feel menacing. Every rustle of leaves could be a hidden person or something worse. The shadows stretch long and deep, seeming to conceal unseen watchers, potential entities drawn to the pervasive suffering. You might find yourself avoiding certain places known through folklore to be associated with dangerous spirits, even though the need for food might drive you close. The fear of the supernatural blends with the very real fear of other starving humans, creating a toxic cocktail of terror. Sleep offers little escape. Your dreams are haunted by images of gaunt figures, whispering malevolently sometimes, offering impossible feasts before the food turns to ash or worms. You dream of voices calling your name from the darkness, offering secrets for survival at a terrible price. You wake up with your heart pounding, unsure if the terror was just a dream or if you heard something real in the night. A low chant, a strange cry in the distance. Well, at least the nightmares are historically accurate. You might mutter, though there's no one to appreciate the gallows humor, the turn towards these darker hidden rituals, curses, potential pacts, acts rooted in desperation and fear, represents a final terrible stage in the famine's erosion of society and self. It's a move away from communal, visible acts, even the grim ones, towards secretive individual attempts to survive by any means, even if those means involve tapping into what were previously considered forbidden powers. It's a reflection of the ultimate isolation brought on by the famine. When community fails, when traditional faith is tested beyond endurance, individuals are left alone to face the void, armed only with their terror and whatever fragments of dark lore they can grasp. You might see evidence of these attempts firsthand. A person withered not just by hunger but by a visible sickness that locals whisper was brought on by a curse from a rival family. Or you might hear tales of someone who seemed to miraculously find food when everyone else starved, only to later meet a strange, terrible end. Proof that terrified survivors would claim that the price of their pact had finally been collected. These stories, whether entirely true or exaggerated by fear, become part of the famine's terrible mythology, reinforcing the dread and warning others against seeking aid from the wrong sources. The air feels heavy with unspoken things. Secrets are guarded fiercely. Who cursed whom, who attempted what forbidden ritual, who is rumored to have made a deal. These secrets become dangerous currency potential, sources of power, or targets for blame if things go wrong. You learn to be silent, to watch, and to trust no one, not even those you once called friends or family, because desperation can push people to betray anyone, even for a sliver of hope offered by a dark entity or the perceived power of a curse. Ah yes, the classic trust no one trope, you think, but applied to literally everything, including potential supernatural bidding wars. Fun times. This descent into the world of dark pacts and curses isn't about faith. It's about a complete lack of it in anything good or reliable. It's the belief that the only powers left are the malevolent ones, and that you must stoop to their level, offer them something terrible just to keep breathing for one more day. It's a heartbreaking distortion of belief twisted by starvation into something ugly and terrifying. As you navigate this landscape of fear and dark whispers, you realize the famine isn't just killing bodies, it's poisoning minds and souls. The line between survival and damnation feels incredibly thin, perhaps non-existent. The rituals here aren't for connection or meaning, but for isolation and a desperate, dangerous gamble against unseen forces. You are witnessing and trying to survive within a society that is not only starving physically, but is consuming itself spiritually, reaching for darkness when the light has utterly failed. The cold reality of hunger meets the ancient fear of the unknown, breeding new terrible forms of human behavior driven by the ultimate soul-crushing powerlessness. That cold void you felt opening up in the last section, the one filled with dark whispers and the chilling possibility of desperate pacts, it's inextricably linked to the sheer, unavoidable presence of death. You can try to bargain with shadows. You can mutter curses against your neighbor. But the one constant, the one absolute truth in this desolate landscape is the rising tide of the dead. They are everywhere. Not just the familiar faces of your own community who have already succumbed, but strangers you see by the roadside. Individuals who collapsed on their desperate journeys, searching for food, families huddled together in death as they were in life, unable to rise again. Death in normal times in the world that existed before this nightmare was a profound event marked by ritual and community. It wasn't just an ending, it was a transition handled with respect and sorrow. There were wakes where the body would be laid out, washed and prepared, often surrounded by mourners, sharing stories, singing laments, perhaps even playing games. A way to both grieve and celebrate a life lived away to ease the passage and comfort the living. The keening, the ancient heart-wrenching wail, was a powerful communal expression of grief, performed often by women specially skilled in the art. A proper burial was paramount, a journey to the consecrated ground of the churchyard, placed in the earth with prayers and blessings ensuring the soul's peace and the community's spiritual well-being. The care taken with the dead was a reflection of the value placed on life and on the continuity between the living and the ancestral past. This deep cultural emphasis on honoring the dead was a mainstream historical fact, woven into the very fabric of Irish society, its laws, its folklore, its faith. But now that world is gone, the sheer volume of death is overwhelming. There are too many bodies and too few living with the strength or the resources to perform the old familiar rites. You stumble over them on paths you once walked safely. You see them lying in fields that should be greening with spring growth, but are instead silent and barren. They are in the abandoned houses, peaceful in death where life was agonizing. The air, even in the biting cold, can carry a faint, sickening sweetness. The smell of decay that you are rapidly becoming accustomed to a smell that scrapes at the back of your throat and makes your stomach clench with a fresh wave of nausea, even when there's nothing in it to come up. You watch helpless as families try to cope. A mother sitting beside the body of her child, too weak to move it, simply covering it with a thin threadbare blanket against the elements and the eyes of the world. Neighbors attempting to dig a grave, their movements slow and labored, the frozen earth resisting every thrust of the shovel. Often the grave is too shallow, barely covering the body, leaving it vulnerable to scavenging animals or the inevitable processes of nature. The careful preparation, the washing, the laying out. These are luxuries of a bygone era. There is no clean water to spare, no strength to lift and clean the cooling flesh. The bodies are simply there. The wakes are gone. Who has the energy to keen? The keening women are starving themselves or dead. The community is too scattered, too weak, too consumed by its own survival to gather in mourning. The shared sorrow, the communal strength that ritual provided is absent. Grief is a solitary burden, now a silent scream swallowed back, because you lack the breath to utter it or the hope that anyone would hear or care. The silence where the keening should be is perhaps the most haunting sound of all. Taking bodies to the churchyard becomes increasingly impossible. The journey is too long, too arduous. You see carts piled high, drawn by emaciated figures, or even individuals pulling the load themselves, a grim procession struggling toward the consecrated ground, only for many to collapse along the way, adding more bodies to the landscape. Eventually, people stop trying. The dead are buried where they fall or where they die, in gardens by the roadside, in small, hastily dug pits behind houses. The sacred ground is out of reach, a symbol of the lost connection to the divine in the community's ordered world. There are mass graves dug by the collective desperate efforts of the few who can still wield a shovel. Large pits where bodies, sometimes dozens, are laid side by side or simply piled in without distinction, without prayer, without name. This is perhaps the greatest indignity, the loss of individual identity even in death. You might help with this grim task, your muscles screaming, your mind numb. You see the faces, some known to you, some utterly unfamiliar, all sharing the same gaunt emptiness. You are robbing them of their distinct resting place, their connection to their ancestors buried in the churchyard. But what choice do you have? The alternative is to leave them where they lie, a spectacle of horror that no living soul can bear for long. Well, at least they're together. You might think the dark humor a fragile shield against the crushing despair. Though I'm pretty sure this isn't the kind of eternal rest anyone signed up for. The lack of proper burial rituals has profound psychological effects. The inability to honor your dead adds another layer of trauma to the already unbearable grief. You feel a deep, aching guilt. You haven't given them the send-off they deserved, the send-off that tradition and belief demanded. You worry about their souls, restless perhaps, because they were not properly eased into the next world. You worry about your own future, having violated such fundamental norms. The dead, unmourned and improperly buried, feel closer somehow, their presence, a constant spectral reminder of the famine's toll and your powerlessness against it. In this chaos, where even the most basic acts of respect become impossible, you might encounter strange ad hoc responses born of desperation. A quirky tidbit, perhaps, from the fringes of behavior during such times. With no wood for coffins, bodies might be wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth are available, or nothing at all. With no way to carry them far, they might be dragged, leaving a terrible trail, and grave markers forget carved stones, or even simple wooden crosses. Often there is nothing, or perhaps you see a desperate survivor placing a single smooth stone, or a broken piece of pottery, or a child's discarded toy on a mound of earth. A pathetic, heartfelt attempt to mark a spot to say, someone lies here, someone who was loved. These are not rituals, but broken gestures, born of the agonizing need to impose some semblance of order or memory on the surrounding chaos, a tiny spark of human dignity fluttering in the face of utter dissolution. Historians still debate the extent to which traditional burial norms completely collapsed across the entire famine-affected region. While the evidence points to widespread failure of traditional rites in the hardest-hit areas, it's an open scholarly debate whether some communities managed to maintain a degree of ritual, perhaps on a smaller, less elaborate scale, or if the breakdown was near total everywhere. Death was rampant. Were these makeshift markers and shallow graves isolated incidents born of extreme necessity? Or did they represent the de facto standard of burial during the worst years? The sheer difficulty in documenting these intimate, often desperate acts makes it challenging to paint a complete picture, leaving the precise scale of the breakdown and its immediate psychological impact on survivors a subject of ongoing study and interpretation. The living are haunted by the dead, not just by their absence, but by the improper way they were dispatched from this world. Every unburied body is an accusation. Every shallow grave is a reminder of failure. You try to turn away to focus on the desperate, immediate task of finding food, of staying warm, of simply breathing. But the dead are a constant, unavoidable presence. They are the physical manifestation of the famine's victory, a landscape littered with defeated bodies. You might find yourself talking to them, murmuring apologies as you step past a body on the path, whispering a hurried prayer over a makeshift grave. It feels like a desperate form of penance, an attempt to reclaim some small measure of the reverence that has been stolen by the circumstances. Or maybe it's just the strain, the isolation, the sheer horror starting to unravel your own grip on reality. Okay, this is getting weird. You might think catching yourself mid-sentence to a silent, unresponsive form. Definitely not the standard historical commentary I signed up for. Note to self, try not to chat with the dearly and indelicately departed. The lack of proper burial isnals has tangible consequences beyond the spiritual or psychological. Bodies left unburied or buried shallowly can spread disease, adding another layer of threat to the already vulnerable population. The very act of death contributes to the ongoing crisis, creating a feedback loop of suffering. The dead are not just victims of the famine, they become a passive agent in its continuation, a source of contamination in a world with no sanitation and no strength to enforce it. The landscape becomes a vast unmarked graveyard. Fields, forests, bogs, all hold their terrible secrets beneath a thin layer of earth, or sometimes no earth at all. You learn to tread carefully, to watch where you step, not just for hidden dangers, but for the resting places of the forgotten. The familiarity of the land is utterly altered. Every hillock could be a grave mound, every dip in the ground a collapsed pit. It's like the earth itself is bruised and scarred by the sheer weight of death it is being forced to absorb without the proper rites of passage. The living look like the walking dead themselves, gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving with slow, shuffling steps. The distinction between the two feels increasingly blurred. You wonder sometimes if you are already among the departed, simply moving through a landscape of shadows, waiting for your own inevitable collapse. The energy needed for rituals, for mourning, for connection, has been entirely diverted to the most basic animalistic drive for survival. There is no room for anything else. The dead are a burden the living cannot bear physically or emotionally any longer. Even if you manage to bury someone you love, the memory of the act is likely tainted by the indignity of it. The shallow grave, the lack of prayer, the absence of community. It feels incomplete, wrong. The grief has no proper outlet, no structure to contain it. It simply festers, adding to the pervasive sense of hopelessness and despair. The dead cannot rest properly, and neither can the living. This breakdown in the handling of death is a stark marker of how deeply the famine has eroded human society. It strips away the fundamental rituals that define us, that connect us to each other, to our past, and to our beliefs. It reduces the profound event of death to a logistical problem: how to dispose of the bodies before they become a greater threat. It is the ultimate dehumanization inflicted not by a conscious enemy, but by the relentless, indifferent force of starvation. You are witnessing the final surrender of form and custom to the brutal reality of entropy played out on the bodies of your friends, your family, your entire world. It's a crushing weight adding to the physical burden the famine imposes. You learn to live with the smell, with the sight, with the constant silent presence of the dead. They are the landscape now. They are the air you breathe. They are the reflection of your own likely future. There are no more tears. You are too dehydrated for them anyway. There is only the grim, determined effort to avoid joining their ranks, even as the task of burying them, honoring them, slips further and further out of reach, a luxury lost to a time that feels like a distant, impossible dream. The proper handling of death was a cornerstone of the old world. Its utter abandonment is a chilling testament to the birth of a new brutal reality, one defined by survival at any cost, even the cost of dignity and death. The weight of the dead, or rather the improper handling of their departure, presses down on you a spiritual and physical burden, adding to the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. The air itself feels heavy with unspoken sorrows and the chilling reminder of what happens when the fundamental structures of life and death dissolve. In this void where old ways have failed and the future holds only uncertainty, your world doesn't simply stop. It begins to twist. It warps into something raw, primal, and deeply unsettling. With the comforting rituals of mourning impossible, with the community scattered, and weakened with the very land becoming a graveyard, the desperate, cornered mind begins to seek answers, or at least solace in new terrifying places. Survival becomes not just the priority, but the only priority. Every other instinct, every social norm, every ingrained belief about right and wrong gets filtered through the lens of sheer agonizing hunger and the desperate need to see another sunrise. You find yourself doing things you never could have imagined. Scavenging isn't just for the dead crows anymore. You eye anything that might hold a calorie. Roots you wouldn't have touched, bark stripped from trees, things that were once considered inedible or even poisonous. You become intimately familiar with the bitter taste of despair, often literally as you chew on substances that offer no real sustenance but quash at the screaming void in your gut for a fleeting moment. Well, this is certainly a change of pace from my usual artisanal sourdough and avocado toast. You might muse grimly to yourself the thought a pathetic attempt at distance from the grim reality of chewing on a twig. Though honestly, I'd trade all the clean eating trends in the world for a single, slightly less dirt-flavored potato right now. The desperation breeds suspicion. Everyone is a potential competitor for scarce resources. Your neighbors, once extensions of your family, are now rivals in a silent, deadly game. You hoard whatever tiny scrap you find, hiding it away like a hunted animal. You watch others with wary eyes, interpreting every action, every gesture, through a filter of fear and distrust. The communal bonds, already strained by grief and hardship, begin to fray completely. You hear whispers, accusations of theft, of hoarding, of even darker deeds committed under the cloak of night or the cover of isolation. Stories circulate like a virus, each one more horrifying than the last, detailing acts driven by an unbearable elemental hunger that pushes people beyond the brink of humanity. In this environment of fear and collapse, the lack of understanding about the famine's cause fuels a terrifying uncertainty. Why has the land turned against you? Why are the animals dying or gone? Why is death so rampant and relentless? Without scientific explanation, the mind grasps for meaning in the only frameworks it knows. The spiritual, the supernatural, the old beliefs in vengeful forces or broken taboos. If the gods or the spirits of the land or some malevolent entity is responsible, then perhaps they can be appeased or tricked or even forced to relent. This is where the rituals you might stumble upon begin to take a darker, more chilling turn. These aren't the familiar, comforting rituals of the past. They are desperate, raw, and born of pure terror. You might see offerings left in strange places. Not the traditional offerings to saints or spirits at sacred wells, but perhaps scraps of precious, inedible things left on the roadside or tied to a barren tree. A pathetic plea directed at unseen forces. A torn piece of cloth, a broken tool, a handful of mud sculpted into a rough shape. Gestures of propitiation or defiance, born of a mind pushed past reason. Someone might be whispering fervent prayers, not in the familiar Latin of the church, but in a strained, desperate version of the old tongue, mixing Christian pleas with appeals to older, wilder powers. The boundaries blur. Christianity had layers of older beliefs woven into it in Ireland anyway. But now, in the face of this unprecedented horror, those older, more fearful elements resurface with a vengeance. A mainstream historical fact here is that in societies facing existential crises, especially those tied to agricultural failure, religious and superstitious practices often intensify, sometimes leading to the emergence of new, syncretic or extreme forms of worship and belief. People look for supernatural explanations when earthly ones fail, and they will resort to desperate spiritual measures when physical ones are impossible. This wasn't unique to 10th century Ireland, but a pattern seen across many cultures and time periods facing similar catastrophes. The specific forms of these practices might vary, but the underlying impulse to seek metaphysical intervention or explanation in the face of inexplicable suffering is a widely documented historical phenomenon. You might witness or hear about acts meant to ward off the perceived evil causing the famine. Charms are made not from woven rushes, but from scavenged bones or strangely shaped stones found in desolate fields. You might see symbols scrawled on doorways or rocks meant to protect the inhabitants, borrowing from old protective marks or inventing new ones in their fear. There are whispers of people seeking out individuals believed to have power. Not the village healer for ailments, but someone who might know curses or counter spells or ways to bargain with whatever malevolent force is believed to be feeding on their world. This isn't the calm, community-sanctioned magic of tradition. It's the furtive, terrifying realm of desperation and forbidden knowledge. A quirky or fringe tidbit might be the reports, if any survived in later folklore, or sparse records of very specific bizarre actions taken by individuals or small groups. Perhaps a story of someone trying to bury the hunger by performing a strange ritual at the boundary of their land, bearing inedible objects and chanting, or a tale of a desperate attempt to appease the pukai nature spirits, often mischievous or malevolent, or other elemental beings, thought to influence the harvest, perhaps leaving grotesque offerings or performing unsettling dances in remote places. These are not the grand communal rites of the past, but isolated, often secretive acts born of intense personal or familial terror and a grasp at any straw of perceived control. Imagine someone meticulously arranging a pile of stones in a precise, complex pattern in a field, utterly convinced this will break the famine's grip. A deeply poignant, utterly futile act, born of a mind fracturing under impossible stress. Okay, if I see anyone trying to do a rain dance with a turnip and a squirrel skeleton, you might think suppressing a hysterical giggle that threatens to spill out, I'm officially tapping out of this historical immersive experience. My threshold for quirky has officially been reached. The psychological toll manifests in strange ways. Some people become withdrawn, silent, simply waiting for the end. Others become frenetic, driven by a frantic energy that belies their physical weakness, constantly searching, constantly moving, unable to rest. There are instances of violence, petty or brutal, driven by the sheer pressure cooker of survival. The breakdown of law and order isn't just about external authority collapsing. It's about the internal moral compass losing its true north in the face of starvation. The line between survival and savagery becomes terrifyingly thin, and you see people step across it, driven by instincts you never knew were lurking beneath the surface of civility. This era presents an open scholarly debate on the interpretation of certain historical accounts or folklore that describes strange behaviors during this time. Did these accounts truly reflect widespread famine rituals in a structured sense? Or were they isolated incidents of madness, extreme superstition, or acts so desperate they were later misinterpreted or exaggerated? Historians still argue whether accounts of certain pacts or offerings were genuine attempts at supernatural intervention, or simply the fevered actions of starving minds, perhaps later embellished in storytelling. The lack of detailed contemporary accounts makes it incredibly difficult to distinguish widespread practice from isolated, desperate acts, leaving the true nature and extent of these chilling rituals open to significant historical debate and interpretation. The air is thick with fierce suspicion and a chilling sense that the world has gone fundamentally wrong. The natural order is inverted, the dead are everywhere and uncared for, while the living engage in desperate, often disturbing behaviors simply to endure. The quiet desperation of starvation breeds its own kind of madness, a collective descent into a state where the rules of the past no longer apply, and the rules of the future are yet to be written, except in the brutal language of survival. You see the desperation in people's eyes, the haunted, hollow look that speaks of things seen and done that can never be forgotten. The chilling rituals of this time aren't about tradition or community. They are about the isolated, terrifying struggle of the individual soul against an indifferent, consuming darkness. You learn to avoid certain places, not because of danger from the living necessarily, but because they are associated with particular acts of desperation or sorrow. A field where a family was found starved together. A lonely tree where a strange offering was tied. These places become imbued with a dark energy, a tangible sense of the suffering they witnessed. They are the new sacred sites of this famine-ravaged land, marked not by piety or tradition, but by the raw, exposed agony of human beings pushed to their absolute limit. The constant awareness of death and the horrifying things people do to avoid it eats away at you. It's a corrosive acid on the soul. You question everything you once believed about human nature, about your neighbors, about yourself. What would you do if pushed just a little further? The question hangs heavy in the air, unanswered but terrifyingly present. The makeshift rituals you see aren't just external oddities. They are reflections of the internal struggle, the frantic search for meaning or control in a world that offers neither. They are the outward manifestation of the chilling truth that when faced with utter annihilation, the human spirit can twist into shapes you never imagined capable of, acts both heartbreakingly futile and profoundly disturbing. This isn't history as a dry list of dates. It's history as a journey into the darkest corners of what it means to be human under unimaginable pressure. Okay, adding existential dread and questioning the fundamental nature of humanity to the historical notes, you might murmur softly. Tonight's podcast is definitely hitting all the high notes of light, sleepy listening. The landscape itself seems to participate in this chilling shift. The familiar hills and valleys take on sinister shapes in the twilight. The wind whispers secrets that sound like mournful cries or desperate pleas. The silence isn't peaceful. It's the absence of life, the quiet before the next collapse. The world outside your starving body feels alien and hostile, a reflection of the internal desolation. The desperate measures and makeshift rituals are attempts to connect with something in this alien world, to exert some tiny sliver of agency against the overwhelming tide of death and despair. They are the final fragile threads of human will, twisting into unsettling shapes as they snap under the strain. You see a figure in the distance silhouetted against the gray sky. Are they digging a grave, searching for food, or performing some desperate personal rite only they understand? You don't know, and you probably won't get close enough to find out. Trust is a luxury no one can afford anymore. Every interaction is a risk, every stranger a potential threat. The chilling rituals are just one more symptom of a world that has come undone, where the deepest instincts of survival have overridden the gentle comforts of community and tradition. You are living in the raw, exposed core of history, and it is a cold, terrifying place. So you've watched the signs gather. The sky isn't right, the fields are sickly, the animals look like walking skeletons, and your neighbors are packing up their meager belongings. The dread has moved beyond a nagging worry and settled into a cold, hard knot in your stomach. You've tried the practical things, rationing, foraging, praying in the usual ways, and they haven't worked. The famine isn't coming anymore. It feels like it's already here, a suffocating blanket descending over your twath. You stand there looking at the thin, sad-eyed cow in the corner of the enclosure, or the scrawny pigs rooting listlessly, and you know you have to do something drastic, something that feels fundamentally wrong, a desperate gamble that might just pay off or might just be the final nail in the coffin. In 10th century Ireland, wealth wasn't measured in gold coins or impressive stone houses. Most people lived in wood and thatch anyway. It was measured very literally in cattle. Cows were the backbone of the economy, the standard of exchange, the source of food, hides, and status. To have many cattle was to be rich. To have few was to be poor. To have none was to be destitute. Other animals, sheep, pigs, horses, also held value, but cattle were king. You're standing in the community. Your ability to pay fines or tribute, even the quality of your feast, depended on your herd. So when famine hit and you looked at your surviving animals, you weren't just seeing potential meals. You were seeing your wealth, your security, your children's future. This foundational truth about Irish society is a mainstream historical fact. Livestock, particularly cattle, was paramount. And this is where the logic of desperation takes hold. When the natural world seems to have turned against you, when the regular cycle of seasons and growth has broken down, and prayer to the Christian God hasn't produced the needed rain or averted the blight, you might conclude that the problem isn't just natural, it must be supernatural. The gods, or perhaps vengeful spirits, or even God himself, must be angry. And how do you appease powerful, angry entities in a world where might makes right and value is tangible? You give them something precious, something that costs you dearly. You make a sacrifice. Sacrificing animals, even valuable ones, was not an alien concept in this era. Pre-Christian Irish society had a long history of offering sacrifices. to gods to the land to ensure good harvests or victory in battle. While Christianity was the dominant religion by the 10th century, older beliefs and practices often lingered, especially in times of extreme crisis. It's like how some people still knock on wood or avoid stepping on cracks, habits that persist long after their original context is forgotten. In a famine, the stakes were too high to rely only on the new ways. Maybe the old gods were also influencing things. Or maybe a grand traditional gesture was exactly what God or whoever was in charge of the weather and the harvest was waiting for. So you contemplate the unthinkable, taking one of your precious starving animals, the one that might get you through another week or be the seed stock for rebuilding later, and offering it up. Not for food, not for trade, but as a gift to the unseen powers. It's the ultimate gamble. You are literally burning a hole in your rapidly shrinking safety net, hoping that this massive, painful loss now will somehow avert total catastrophe later. It's like being on a sinking ship and throwing your life raft overboard because you believe the sea god will be impressed by your faith and calm the waves. Highly illogical, deeply desperate, and tragically common. The choice of animal might matter. Was it the finest, fattest animal you had left? Unlikely in a famine, but perhaps the least scrawny. Was it a specific color? A white cow which held particular symbolic significance in Celtic traditions? Was it a young, healthy one representing future potential? Or was it an older, less productive animal, but still one that represented a significant portion of your remaining wealth? The sources are sparse on the exact details of famine sacrifices, but general knowledge of Irish society suggests that the value of the offering was paramount. You had to give something that hurt to lose. Otherwise, what kind of offering was it? Giving up your sickliest sheep probably wouldn't cut it. You had to look that sad-eyed cow in the face, the one whose milk was already dwindling, but whose hide alone was worth something, and say goodbye. Where would such a sacrifice take place? Perhaps at a traditional sacred site, an ancient standing stone, a holy well, a particular grove of trees that felt heavy with old power. Monasteries, while centers of Christian worship and sometimes charity, might also become sites where people brought offerings in times of need, hoping the saints or God himself would intervene. Some scholars suggest that certain geographical features like mountains or significant rivers were considered places where the natural and supernatural worlds met, making them potential locations for such desperate acts. You might drag the chosen animal, perhaps decorated with ribbons or special markings, to a place that felt charged with spiritual energy, a place where you felt your plea had the best chance of being heard. The ritual itself would likely be deeply solemn, tinged with both profound loss and desperate hope. You might speak ancient words, perhaps a mix of Christian prayers and older invocations. You might shed tears not just for the animal, but for the state of the world that demanded such an act. The smell of the animal, the feel of its rough coat under your hands, the sound of its lowing. These would be intensely present details in a moment of such heightened emotion. You would perform the act, whatever it entailed, with a heavy heart and eyes fixed on the indifferent sky, searching for any sign that your sacrifice had been accepted, that the turning point had arrived. A quirky tidbit, sometimes mentioned in folklore, is the idea of sacrificing a white animal, particularly a white cow, during times of crisis. While hard archaeological evidence directly linking this specific act to famine in the 10th century is difficult to pin down, definitively white animals, especially cattle, held significant symbolic importance in pre-Christian Celtic beliefs, often associated with purity, the divine, or the otherworld. The persistence of this idea in later folklore suggests that color and type of animal may have mattered in desperate attempts to connect with supernatural forces. So it might not just be an animal, it might be the animal, the purest, the most symbolically potent one you had. It's like in the movies where they always have to sacrifice the cute dog, not the grumpy cat. It just feels higher stakes. Historians still argue whether these famine-driven sacrifices were purely a continuation of pagan practices, perhaps resurfacing under pressure, or if they represented a desperate attempt to integrate older beliefs into a Christian framework, essentially trying to cover all the bases when the chips were down. Was it seen as an offering to God in a manner he might understand from older times? Or was it a turning away from the new faith back to something older and more primal? The sources from this period are often written by Christian monks who might interpret such acts purely as pagan idolatry, obscuring the complex motivations of a starving populace simply trying to survive. The truth is likely messy, a blend of old fears and new anxieties, a spiritual Hail Mary pass. Think about the weight of that decision. You are standing there, your stomach rumbling, knowing that animal could be food for days, maybe weeks if stretched thin enough. You know its value in exchange could buy you a small amount of grain from a region slightly less affected if you could find one. Yet the belief that this visible, tangible sacrifice might appease an invisible spiritual cause is so strong, so compelling in its desperation that you go through with it. It's the logic of doing something when all practical options seem exhausted. It's the human need for agency in the face of overwhelming helplessness, even if that agency takes a terrifying form. You are choosing to believe that the world isn't just cruel and random. It's governed by forces that can be influenced, even bribed with a gift of unimaginable value. These weren't just isolated incidents. While specific records are scarce, oblique references in annals and later folklore suggest that such desperate measures were not unheard of during prolonged periods of scarcity. The community might even encourage it, seeing it as a necessary communal effort to save everyone. The pressure to contribute to the collective appeasement could be immense. Imagine the village elder looking at your surviving livestock, then looking at the starving children and suggesting ever so gently that perhaps a significant offering was needed. The lines between personal survival and communal obligation blurred completely in the face of starvation. And what if the sacrifice worked? What if shortly after the offering the rain came, or the blight retreated, or a ship laden with grain miraculously appeared in the nearest estuary? The causal link, however coincidental, would be cemented in the minds of the people. The terrible cost would be justified. The gamble would have paid off. The belief in the efficacy of such desperate rituals would be reinforced, making them more likely to occur in future crises. Conversely, if the famine continued unabated, if the animal was sacrificed, and the sky remained stubbornly clear, the despair would deepen, perhaps leading to even more extreme measures. The act of sacrificing valuable livestock during a famine highlights the fundamental worldview of the time, that the physical world was deeply intertwined with the spiritual, and that human actions, even drastic and painful ones, could influence cosmic forces. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about understanding why you weren't surviving and trying to correct that perceived imbalance. It was a conversation with the divine, shouted in a language of pain and loss, hoping for a reply in the form of a miracle. You stood there, having given up your last vestige of security, utterly exposed, waiting for the heavens to respond. It's like setting your entire retirement fund on red at the roulette table. You know, the odds are terrible. You know, it's probably a terrible idea. But the alternative feels like certain ruin anyway. And maybe, just maybe, this one insane risk will save you. Except in 10th century Ireland, the casino wasn't a building. It was the universe, and the dealer was fate or the gods or whatever power you believed held sway over life and death. And the chips, they were your very means of survival, offered up on a prayer and a desperate hope. So you made the sacrifice. You stood there amidst the dwindling remnants of your community, smelling the smoke, or seeing the still form, having offered up the most precious thing you own, short of your own skin. You watched the sky, waited for the rain that didn't come, for the ships that didn't appear, for the crops that didn't miraculously spring forth from the parched earth. The days bled into weeks, and the hunger in your belly only grew sharper, a constant gnawing ache that now felt accompanied by a crushing weight in your chest. The knowledge that your ultimate gamble, your desperate, agonizing offering of your valuable livestock, had seemingly changed nothing. The famine continues its relentless march. The weak grow weaker, the sick die faster. The social fabric, already stretched thin, begins to tear. The customary rules of behavior, the bonds of kinship and community that usually hold everything together, start to fray under the unbearable pressure. People hoard what little they have, suspicion replaces trust, and the desperate scramble for survival erodes empathy. You see it in your neighbor's eyes, that haunted, calculating look that tells you they are thinking only of themselves and their immediate family, perhaps not even that far. Remember that sense of community, how everyone pitched in for the harvest, or helped build a new house that feels like a story from another lifetime now. This is the grim reality of deep, soul-crushing scarcity. It can turn people into strangers, or worse, into threats. You walk past the field where you once hoped the grain would sprout, now just cracked earth and skeletal weeds, and the thought hits you cold and sharp like a shard of ice. If the most valuable thing you possessed wasn't enough to appease the forces that controlled life and death, what would be? What could possibly hold more value, be a more significant offering, represent a greater, more painful loss than your prized animal? The answer whispered by the wind through the starving trees is horrifyingly clear: a human life. This is where the logic of desperation curdles into something truly monstrous. You've moved beyond property, beyond possessions, into the realm of the sacred and the taboo. Taking a human life, especially outside of warfare or sanctioned execution, was deeply forbidden by both Christian doctrine and the Brand laws that governed Irish society. Mainstream historical fact: the Brand laws, complex and sophisticated, laid out clear rules regarding homicide, injury, and compensation, reflecting a society that under normal circumstances placed a defined value on human life and sought to regulate its taking. Yet here you are in circumstances far from normal, where survival itself seems to be the only law, left contemplating an act that violates every principle you were raised with. Why a human? The twisted reasoning might go like this: the gods or God or the spirits of the land are immensely powerful. They have withheld the bounty of the earth, inflicting this suffering. Your animal sacrifice wasn't enough because it wasn't costly enough. What is the most valuable thing in the world? A life. Not just any life perhaps, but one that matters, one that represents something significant. It's the ultimate offering, the final card to play when all others have failed. It's a terrifying echo of ancient practices, perhaps only dimly remembered or twisted by rumor and fear, resurfacing in a time when the present is unbearable and the future non-existent. Who would be the target of such a desperate, horrific act? This is where the darkness deepens. Would it be an outsider, a stranger passing through? Unlikely, as travel is scarce and fear is rampant. Would it be someone vulnerable, an elderly person, a child, someone already weakened by hunger? This is a chilling possibility, preying on those least able to resist. Would it be someone important, someone whose loss would be felt profoundly by the community, thus increasing the perceived value of the offering? Or in the most desperate, soul-shattering scenarios, whispered in the darkest corners of folklore, would it be one of your own, a member of your family, chosen in a moment of collective madness or individual despair, believed to be the only price high enough to avert total annihilation? This is the nutter of the famine's horror, where the lines between human being and sacrificial offering blur into a terrifying mist. Historians still argue whether systematic human sacrifice as a famine ritual was truly a widespread practice in 10th century Christian Ireland, or if accounts of it are exaggerated by later Christian sources, eager to portray pre-Christian or desperate folk practices as barbaric paganism. While archaeological evidence of pre-Christian human sacrifice exists, like the bog bodies found in Ireland and elsewhere, some of which show signs of ritual killing, linking these specific acts to famine in the 10th century, with hard, irrefutable proof, is incredibly difficult. The line between ritual offering, desperate act born of madness, and simple murder driven by hunger or despair becomes incredibly blurred in the few, often vague historical references. Yet the idea persists in folklore and cautionary tales passed down through generations. A quirky or fringe tidbit often associated with famine-related human sacrifice in some folklore traditions, not just Irish, but across cultures facing similar extremes, is the concept of sacrificing a king, or a person of high status, or someone considered exceptional in some way. Perhaps the most beautiful maiden, the strongest warrior, or a person with some physical or mental peculiarity. The logic, however warped, was that the higher the status or the more unique the person, the more potent the offering would be in the eyes of the divine powers. It's the ultimate extension of the giving something that hurts principle, giving the most valuable item in your society. You might imagine the scene not a grand temple or a public ceremony, but perhaps a hushed, terrifying gathering in a secluded place. A dark grove, a lonely hilltop, a forgotten pagan site. The air would be thick with a mixture of fear, despair, and a horrifying sense of grim necessity. The decision, if made by a group, would likely have involved agonizing debate, overridden by the sheer blind panic of starvation. The victim, perhaps chosen by lot or simply seized, would represent the community's final terrifying gamble. The act itself, shrouded in secrecy and shame, would be performed with a heavy heart if there was any humanity left in the people performing it, or perhaps with a chilling, numb detachment born of utter despair. The silence afterwards would be deafening, broken only by the wind and the faraway groans of the starving. You would look at the sky just as you did after the animal sacrifice, but this time with a mixture of terror and a faint, almost extinguished spark of hope. Had it worked? Had this ultimate horrific act finally brought reprieve? The weight of the sin or the terrible necessity would press down on you perhaps more heavily than the hunger itself. How do you live with yourself after participating in such a thing, even if driven by the most extreme circumstances? This contemplation, this move from sacrificing wealth animals to sacrificing life humans, marks the deepest point of the famine's descent. It is the point where society essentially ceases to function as a recognizable entity and reverts to a primal state driven solely by the instinct for survival, however warped. It is the shedding of laws, morals, and taboos under the unbearable pressure of physical extinction. It is the point where the fear of dying by starvation outweighs the fear of divine punishment or human justice. The very idea that such acts might have been contemplated, even if rarely carried out in practice, speaks volumes about the sheer scale of suffering and desperation during these times. It highlights how quickly the veneer of civilization can crack when the most basic human needs, food, water, security, are stripped away. It's easy for us sitting here comfortably with full bellies and grocery stores down the street to judge such actions. But put yourself there watching your children waste away, your own body failing, and the world outside offering no help, no hope. What terrifying compromises might you consider? The sources that mention these possibilities are often vague, perhaps deliberately so. Christian writers were quick to condemn any hint of pagan practice, and the shame associated with contemplating or performing such acts would ensure they were rarely recorded directly or honestly by those involved. So we are left with fragments, whispers in the historical record, and the chilling understanding that famine could push people to the absolute brink of human behavior, transforming the unimaginable into a desperate, horrifying possibility. It wasn't just about appeasing gods anymore. It was about screaming at the universe with the most painful sound you could make, hoping it would finally pay attention. It was about giving up the most valuable thing you knew in the desperate hope that the cosmic balance so clearly askew might somehow be righted. It was the ultimate tragic expression of helplessness, disguised as a terrifying act of agency. You are standing on the edge of an abyss, having peered into the darkest possibilities of human behavior under duress. The hunger is still there, the world is still desolate, but now there is also the crushing weight of what has been contemplated, or perhaps, God forbid, what has been done. The air feels heavy with unspoken horrors, and the future seems not just bleak, but tainted by the terrible steps taken in the name of survival. So you stood there, maybe just thinking about it, maybe having gone through with it. The darkest act imaginable, the horrifying leap into the abyss of human sacrifice, driven by a desperation that gnawed at your soul as fiercely as the hunger gnawed at your gut. You offered the most valuable thing you could conceive of a human life, perhaps one you loved, perhaps one chosen by dreadful circumstance, believing, hoping, praying that this ultimate price would finally shift the cosmic scales, loosen the grip of the famine, and bring salvation. You looked at the sky again, you felt the emptiness of the air, you listened for the sound of distant relief, and the rain didn't come. The crops didn't miraculously appear overnight plump and ready for harvest. The ships carrying aid didn't suddenly materialize on the horizon. The hunger in your belly remained a cold, hard stone, now perhaps joined by a different kind of sickness, a profound, soul-deep horror at what you had done, or what your community had done, or even what you had merely considered doing. The ultimate gamble failed. The abyss stared back, and it was just as empty as before, perhaps even more so now that it was stained with a terrible, unforgettable act. This is the bleakest part of the long story of famine. It's not just the suffering, but the terrible realization that even the most extreme measures born of unimaginable pain and fear can be utterly futile. The world didn't care about your sacrifice. The impersonal forces of weather disease and disrupted trade continued their relentless march. The social bonds already strained to breaking point might now snap entirely under the weight of this shared terrible secret, or the open knowledge of what occurred. Trust is annihilated. The community is poisoned from within, even if a few more people survive for a little longer. Life continues, or rather, existence continues in the shadow of this failure. You trudge through the days scavenging for roots, boiling bark, maybe finding a stray bird or a desperate rodent. The strong prey on the weak. The sick die alone. Children, their bellies swollen, their eyes vacant, fade away like embers. You see things, do things that haunt your nightmares. Things that make the memory of your once normal life feel like a fairy tale told to someone else. You are reduced to a primal state where survival is the only imperative and everything else, morality, kinship, hope, feels like a luxury you can no longer afford. It's like trying to run a modern bureaucracy when everyone's just trying to find a potato. The old rules just don't apply. Excuse me, do you have Form 7G for bark consumption approval? Yeah, right. But famines, even the worst ones, don't last forever, although in the moment it feels like they will. This isn't a sudden Hollywood ending. It's a slow, agonizing crawl back towards life, what eventually breaks the cycle. Often it's simply the turning of the seasons. If enough people survive through the leanest months, if they manage to hold on to a few precious seeds or a breeding pair of animals, if the next planting season sees kinder weather, a little more rain here, a little less frost there, then hope that fragile, almost forgotten thing can begin to sprout alongside the first tentative green shoots in the fields. Sometimes relief comes from outside, though in the 10th century, this was incredibly slow and unreliable. A lord might finally distribute grain from his stores, though he risks impoverishing himself. A monastery might open its granaries, though they too are finite resources. Trade routes, if they were disrupted by Vikings or internal conflict, might gradually reopen, allowing some food to trickle back in. Remember that hint of Viking activity we talked about earlier? If that calmed down, it could help things slowly improve. It's not a cavalry charge over the hill. It's more like watching paint dry, except the paint is slowly turning green with edible possibility. Mainstream historical fact famines in medieval Ireland were often localized or regional, triggered by specific climatic events like excessive rain, early frosts, or droughts, or disruptions like warfare and disease outbreaks. While communication and transport were limited, it meant that while one area starved, a neighboring region might have a slightly better harvest or access to coastal resources, allowing for eventual, though often insufficient, movement of supplies and people. Survivors might trek to these rumored areas of plenty, or those areas might slowly send aid. The recovery is painful and slow. The fields might be empty, the animals gone, the tools lost or sold for scraps of food. Many of the strongest who could have worked the land are dead. The survivors are weak, scarred, and deeply traumatized. How do you rebuild a community when half the people are gone, when trust has been shattered by desperation, and the memory of who did what to survive hangs heavy in the air? Historians still argue whether the demographic and social impacts of these severe famines fundamentally altered the structure of Irish society in certain regions, leading to long-term shifts in settlement patterns or land ownership. Was it just a temporary shock, or did it leave permanent scars on the societal fabric, a quirky or fringe tidbit related to recovery? In some folk traditions, the ending of a famine wasn't just marked by the return of food, but by specific rituals intended to cleanse the land and the people of the famine's sickness, or the stain left by the desperate acts performed. These might involve communal feasts, even if small, symbolic burials of the hunger spirit, or ceremonies to welcome back the fertility of the earth. It wasn't enough for the hunger to stop. The memory and the pollution of the famine had to be addressed too, perhaps including the terrible acts you witnessed or contemplated. It's like needing therapy after a really bad group project, but instead of complaining about Bob not doing his share, you're dealing with the fact that someone ate the project proposal. You, having survived, face the monumental task of simply living. You try to plant what little seed you have, the soil feeling alien and resistant. You look for others navigating the landscape of grief and suspicion. Every small success, a handful of berries found a tiny sprout emerging from the earth, feels like an immense victory. The jokes feel inappropriate, now even the dark ones. The sarcasm seems hollow. There's just a quiet, bone-deep weariness. The physical recovery is hard enough, but the mental and emotional toll is perhaps even greater. How do you look your neighbor in the eye if you know they hoarded food while your family starved? How do you rebuild trust in a community where the unthinkable was contemplated or done? The silence about the worst horrors of the famine is probably deafening, a collective trauma that everyone knows but no one speaks of directly. It's stuffed down, buried, hoping it won't surface much, like you might bury something precious in the hopes it survives the hardship. Over time, measured not in weeks but in years, the landscape slowly changes. The dead are buried, the fields are gradually replanted, and if the weather holds, harvests improve. Animals are slowly bred or acquired again. Trade routes solidify. The rhythms of life, the planting and harvesting, the community gatherings, at first maybe hesitant and strained, slowly reassert themselves. The world starts to feel less hostile, less utterly defined by the gnawing ache in your stomach. The sound of children playing thin and weak at first gradually becomes more common. But the famine leaves its mark. Survivors carry physical scars, chronic weakness, and the psychological burden of what they endured. The population is reduced, and it takes generations to recover lost numbers. The stories, whispered and incomplete, are passed down warnings of the fragility of existence and the terrifying things people are capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. You never forget the smell of hunger, the look in the eyes of the starving, or the chilling silence that followed the ultimate futile gestures of desperation. You learned in the hardest possible way just how thin the veneer of civilization can be and how quickly it can crack when the earth refuses to give up its bounty. This journey through 10th century Irish famine rituals, from appealing to saints to contemplating the darkest sacrifices, brings us back to the present moment, leaving the echoes of that desperate time behind. You've walked in the worn, empty shoes of someone facing the unimaginable, someone for whom survival became the only law. You've seen how deeply ingrained beliefs and ancient fears could surface when the world turned against them, how rituals could evolve from hopeful appeasement to terrifying acts of last resort. It's a stark reminder of the power of nature, the fragility of human society, and the incredible, often horrifying lengths people will go to when facing absolute extinction. Word count 2199. Okay, the journey through the past is drawing to a close now. As the images of the stark, hungry landscape begin to fade, let your mind return gently to your own quiet space, warm and safe. Leave the echoes of the wind and the hunger behind. Feel the softness of your pillow, the comfort of your blanket. The desperation of the 10th century is a story told, a moment visited now, settling back into the vast quiet of history. There's nothing left to do but breathe easily, let the final tendrils of the past dissolve, and allow your body to grow heavy and relaxed. The fear and the hunger belong only to the story now, not to you. Just let yourself drift, drift, drift.